She found the text message by accident. One glance at her husband's phone while he stood in the shower, and 8 years of marriage collapsed in a single sentence. Tonight, we finally show up together. No more excuses about leaving Meline at home. Her husband was taking another woman to the most important event in their industry, the same industry she had secretly built his empire in. The same man who had stolen her mind, her career, her identity, and was now planning to discard her like she never existed. But Meline Carter wasn't going to disappear quietly. If you want to witness the most calculated, devastating comeback in corporate history, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The bathroom door was still closed when Meline set the phone back on the nightstand. She did it carefully, precisely, the way she did everything, the way she had always done everything, with a control so practiced it had become invisible even to herself. The screen darkened, the words disappeared, and the shower kept running on the other side of the wall, steam curling under the gap at the bottom of the door, like something trying to escape. Meline sat on the edge of the bed in the gray November dark and did not move. Tonight we finally show up together. No more excuses about leaving Meline at home. I'm tired of being your secret E. She had seen it by accident, truly by accident, reaching for her own phone on the nightstand, fingers brushing the wrong device in the darkness. One glance. That was all it had taken. One glance and the floor had dropped out from under 8 years. She listened to the water running. She listened to the familiar sounds of her husband in the shower, the particular rhythm of it, the way the pressure shifted when he turned. She had listened to those sounds thousands of times. She knew them the way she knew her own heartbeat, but something had changed in the last 60 seconds, something that could not be unchanged. She had expected to feel something violent, rage maybe, or grief, the kind that comes up through the floor and swallows you whole. Instead, what she felt was stranger and colder and far more dangerous. Clarity. It arrived the way a diagnosis arrives, quietly, without theater. As if some part of her had already known, had been holding space for this information for a long time, had simply been waiting for the moment it would finally be confirmed. Her breathing was steady, her hands were still. Years of courtroom training, 6 years at Patterson and Rhodes, before she had walked away from all of it for him, had made her body a reliable instrument even when her mind was screaming. She stood. She crossed to her desk in the corner of the bedroom. She opened her laptop, and she began to type. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan had come to find her in her home office, the converted guest room where she spent most of her days, now surrounded by market analyses and contract frameworks and the quiet industry of someone who had agreed to be invisible. It was a Tuesday afternoon. She remembered because she had been in the middle of a particularly complex tariff analysis for the Jakarta deal, and the interruption had cost her the thread of her reasoning. Meline. He appeared in the doorway the way he always did, slightly harried, already tugging at his tie, projecting the mild chaos of a very important man with too many things on his mind. I need you to look at the Jakarta contract one more time. She looked up from her screen. I went through it twice already. The tariff structures are sound. The partnership framework protects us if their government regulations shift. I know. He moved into the room, set his briefcase on the chair across from her desk with the ease of a man who had never questioned his right to occupy any space he entered. But Morrison from the board had some questions about the exit clauses. Can you just simplify the language? Make it more accessible. Meline felt the familiar tightness begin in her jaw. She had learned to keep it out of her face. You mean rewrite the section I spent 4 days researching so it sounds like it came from a business magazine instead of someone with a law degree? Don't be like that. His tone shifted the gentle condescension she had been cataloging for years, the particular register he used when he wanted to manage her without appearing to manage her. You know how these guys are. They want reassurance, not legal jargon. She saved her document without responding. He walked behind her desk, placed his hands on her shoulders. She could smell his cologne, the expensive one she had given him for their anniversary 3 years ago. You're brilliant at this, he said softly. You know that, right? I couldn't do any of this without you. She stared at her screen, at the 47 pages of trade analysis she had built from scratch over the past 2 weeks. at the timestamps that would never appear in any company document with her name attached. Then maybe you should tell them that, she said. Tell who? The board. Morrison. Anyone. She turned in her chair to look up at him. Ethan, I used to be a corporate attorney. I had a career. Now I spend my days doing uncredited work while you what? His voice changed, subtle, a shift in temperature. Build a company that supports both of us. I thought together meant something different. He glanced at his watch. That small practiced gesture she had learned to recognize the tell that announced he was already somewhere else. Already moving toward the next thing, the next room, the next person who needed his attention more urgently than his wife did. I have to get to the office, he said. Chloe scheduled the investor call for 3, and I still need to prep. Meline repeated the name carefully. Chloe, my executive assistant. He was already gathering his briefcase, already halfway out of the conversation. She's been invaluable with the international partnerships, really sharp. How old is she? The question seemed to surprise him. He paused. I don't know, 26, 27. Why does that matter? It doesn't, Meline said. She turned back to her computer. I'll have the revisions to you by 6. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer. She could feel him standing there, could feel the weight of his hesitation, his desire to smooth whatever had just crinkled between them. But the investor call won. It always did. We'll talk later, he said. Maybe that Italian place you like this weekend. She didn't answer. She listened to his footsteps on the hardwood, the front door opening, his car starting in the driveway. She sat in the silence that followed and let herself close her eyes for exactly 4 seconds. Then she opened them and went back to work. The filing cabinet in the corner of her office held a folder she had been building for almost a year. It had started almost unconsciously, a professional instinct, the kind of habit that never entirely leaves a litigator. Copies of contracts she had authored, market analyses bearing Ethan's signature, strategic framework she had developed over weeks of research that had been rolled out in board meetings as executive vision. She had started keeping them the way some people keep journals, a record of what actually happened, a counter-narrative to the one being written without her. Lately she had been adding to it with more deliberate purpose. She told herself it was insurance. She told herself she wasn't sure what she was preparing for. Standing in her home office that Tuesday afternoon after his car had disappeared down the street, she opened the cabinet and looked at the folder and understood with a certainty that sat in her chest like cold iron exactly what she had been preparing for. She just hadn't been willing to name it yet. The International Trade Council Gala was the event of the year for anyone who moved serious money across serious borders. It was where partnerships were forged over crystal champagne flutes, where reputations were built or quietly destroyed in the space of a handshake, where the architecture of global commerce was sketched on cocktail napkins and then formalized in boardrooms the following Monday morning. Meline had attended the gala with Ethan for 3 consecutive years. She had stood beside him in designer gowns and made precise, elegant conversation, and watched him work a room the way a master carpenter works wood, with apparent ease that concealed enormous calculation. Last year, she had helped him prepare his keynote speech on ethical supply chains, staying up until midnight to refine the language to make his talking points sing. 2 weeks before the gala, he told her he preferred to go alone. It's going to be a lot of business talk, he said over breakfast, not quite meeting her eyes. You'd probably be bored. Meline set down her coffee cup. I've never been bored before. I just mean it's heavy on networking this year. Lots of one-on-one investor conversations. He smiled, that particular smile, the warm one, the one that had first pulled her toward him at a law school mixer a decade ago. Why don't you take the evening for yourself? Go to that spa you like. My treat. She should have known then. She had known then. Some part of her had known. But she had needed to believe otherwise, had needed the version of reality where her husband was simply distracted and overextended and not actively arranging for another woman to occupy the space in his life that Meline had been quietly vacating for years. So she had accepted the explanation. She had thanked him for the spa offer. She had gone back to her Jakarta revisions. And then on a gray November night 3 weeks later, she had reached for her phone in the dark and picked up the wrong one. She worked through the night while Ethan slept. He came out of the bathroom in his robe, hair damp, and found her at her laptop at the small desk in the corner of the bedroom. She told him she couldn't sleep. She told him she had an idea about the Jakarta secondary clause that she wanted to capture before she lost it. He kissed the top of her head and told her not to work too late and went to bed. He was asleep within 12 minutes. She had counted. She worked until 4 in the morning. The folder she built that night was different from the one in the filing cabinet. This one was encrypted. This one was organized with the precision of a litigation strategy because that was what it was. Project reclamation, confidential. She began with documentation. Every contract she had ever written for Caldwell Global, every strategic analysis, every market expansion model, every single document that bore Ethan's signature but contained her intellectual architecture. She pulled them from the company's shared cloud storage, from her own email archives, from the digital trail she had been leaving for 5 years without quite realizing she was leaving it. By 3 in the morning, she had a comprehensive portfolio. Dated, time-stamped, cross-referenced with company filings that established a clear, irrefutable chain she had developed, the framework Ethan had implemented it under his name, the company had grown. By 4, she had moved to phase 2. She opened Ethan's email he left himself logged in on the shared laptop, a carelessness that had never bothered her before tonight, and she read. What she found was worse than she had imagined. The affair with Chloe had been going on for at least 14 months based on the timestamps. The messages were a nauseating architecture of professional collaboration and personal intimacy, layered so thoroughly it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Chloe sending him revised presentation decks, the same decks Meline had built. Ethan praising her for insights that had originated in this room at this desk by the woman sleeping 2 feet away. But it was one exchange that stopped Meline cold. When are you finally going to tell her Chloe had written 6 months ago? Soon. I promise. I just need to figure out the right timing. You've been saying that for a year, E. I'm not going to be your secret forever. You're not a secret. You're my future. Meline is complicated. Complicated how she's contributed to the company. I need to handle this carefully. Make sure she can't claim any ownership when we divorce. Meline read that sentence 3 times. Make sure she can't claim any ownership. So that was the strategy. Keep her invisible. Keep her contributions uncredited. Erase her from the official record of everything she had built. And when the time came to trade her in, when it was finally convenient to let go of the woman who had given up her career to build his, he could walk away with everything, leaving her with nothing, not even the acknowledgement that she had ever mattered. The cold clarity that had formed in her chest 3 hours ago crystallized into something harder, something that would not melt. She closed his email. She opened a new browser window, and she searched for a name she had been reading about in industry publications for 2 years, Victor Alvarez. CEO Alvarez International Trade Corporation, Ethan's biggest competitor. The man who had been trying to crack the European markets that Caldwell Global had dominated, markets built entirely on frameworks Meline had developed in this room while her husband took the credit. She found his company website, his recent interviews. And then she found an article from 6 months ago in which Alvarez had spoken about his frustration with what he called the industry's crisis of attribution, specifically calling out unnamed competitors who had built reputations on other people's work. Meline opened a new email account under a pseudonym and began to compose a message. Mr. Alvarez, you don't know me, but I have information about Caldwell Global's European expansion strategy that I believe would be of significant interest to you. More importantly, I can provide insight into a pattern of systematic intellectual property misattribution that has been occurring within the company for the past 5 years. She paused. Read it back. Made 3 small adjustments to the language, sharpening, without sharpening precise, without being aggressive. If you're interested in a conversation about ethical business practices and the importance of proper credit for strategic innovation, I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you discreetly. I will contact you again in 1 week with a proposed meeting location. Respectfully, a concerned industry professional. She sent it before she could second-guess herself. Then she sat back in the chair she had spent 5 years occupying in invisible service and looked at the sleeping form of the man she had loved and listened to the sound of her own breathing in the dark. Ethan came home that evening with flowers. Expensive roses, the boutique florist downtown, the one he went to when he needed the gesture to announce itself clearly. He kissed her cheek in the kitchen, handed them over with a warm smile, and told her she was his brilliant wife, and that he knew he had been distracted lately and that the gala prep was consuming everything. I was thinking, he continued, loosening his tie, moving to the refrigerator as though the kitchen were a stage he had performed on 1,000 times. After the gala is over, why don't we take that trip we've been talking about, Paris maybe, or the Amalfi Coast, just the two of us? That sounds wonderful, Meline said. She filled a vase with water. Her movements were careful and precise. And actually, he paused with his beer halfway to his lips. I know I said you didn't have to come to the gala, but I've been reconsidering. Maybe it would be good for us to be there together. Show a united front. Meline's hand stilled on the vase, just for a half second. Then she resumed. What changed your mind? She asked lightly. I don't know. I guess I just miss having you beside me at these things. He moved behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, a warmth so practiced and familiar it almost undid her. You always know exactly what to say to people, how to make them feel comfortable. For a moment, one terrible, treacherous moment, she felt the pull of it. The pull of this version of him, this warm and plausible version that she had spent 8 years trying to hold on to. Then she remembered, make sure she can't claim any ownership when we divorce. I'd love to come, she said softly. If you're sure I won't be in the way. Never. He kissed the top of her head. You could never be in the way. She smiled and closed her eyes. And behind her closed eyes, she was already counting days, already building timelines, already arranging the pieces of the most important thing she had ever constructed. Not a contract, not a market analysis, not someone else's strategy bearing someone else's name. This time she was building her own reckoning. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks. She started with her appearance, a decision that surprised her because she had never been particularly invested in surfaces. But she understood with the cold strategic clarity that had replaced every softer emotion in her chest that the gala was theater. And in theater, costume mattered. She found a stylist in the city who specialized in what the woman's website called transformative presentation, a phrase that sounded like corporate euphemism but turned out to be exactly what it promised. Meline brought a single photograph to the consultation. A European businesswoman she had seen in a magazine, all sharp elegance and absolute authority, the kind of woman who walked into rooms and changed their temperature. I want to look like power, Meline said. Not pretty, not approachable. Power. The stylist studied her for a long moment. Then she smiled the way professionals smile when they recognize a challenge they are genuinely qualified for. I know exactly what you need. The dress came first. Emerald silk that moved like deep water, cut with the kind of precision that announced money without announcing itself. The color was deliberate, bold enough to demand attention in any room, sophisticated enough to signal that the attention was warranted. Then the hair. The stylist convinced her to go darker, adding rich undertones that made her skin luminous, pulling the style back into a sleekness that transformed her bone structure into something architectural. And then the makeup, an hour of careful accumulating drama that arrived as mystery. Smoky eyes that suggested depth, a wine-dark lip that commanded silence before she had said a word. When Meline looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman looking back at her had never been hidden. The woman looking back at her occupied her own space in the world as a matter of simple fact, the way gravity occupies a room. Perfect, Meline whispered. But Victor Alvarez responded to her email within 48 hours. They met at a private club in the financial district, the kind of establishment where the walls themselves seemed to understand the value of discretion. Meline arrived as Meline Morrow, close enough to feel natural, different enough to maintain the distance she needed. She had prepared a persona, a consultant for a European investment consortium, specializing in international trade strategy, with deep knowledge of the markets Ethan had been claiming as his own conquest. Alvarez was in his early 50s, silver-haired, sharp-eyed in the way of men who have spent decades reading rooms and reading people and rarely being wrong about either. He rose when she entered the private dining room and extended his hand with the warmth of someone who extends warmth as a professional tool. Miss Morrow, he said, thank you for agreeing to meet. I appreciate your discretion. Meline said, shaking his hand with a grip that did not apologize for itself. They ordered coffee, and she got straight to business because she had learned in 6 years of litigation, in 5 years of invisible strategy work, that the most effective thing a person can do in any negotiation is refuse to waste the other person's time. I have detailed knowledge of Caldwell Global's European expansion strategy, she said. Not just the public-facing information, the actual strategic framework that's driving their success in markets you've been trying to penetrate for years. Alvarez leaned back in his chair and studied her. And why would you share this with me? Because I believe in proper attribution of intellectual property, and because Ethan Caldwell has built his reputation on work that isn't his own. She held his gaze. I've spent 5 years watching someone take credit for strategies and analyses that came from someone else's expertise. I've watched that person build an empire on stolen intellectual capital while keeping the actual architect completely invisible. And you're willing to prove this. I can provide documentation, dated files, comparative analysis showing the origin of every major strategic initiative Caldwell Global has implemented in the European market. She paused. But I want something in return. Alvarez smiled slightly, the smile of a man who had expected this. Of course, what do you need? I need you to attend the International Trade Council Gala. She pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. I need you to be particularly attentive when the discussion turns to intellectual property rights and ethical business practices. And I need you to be prepared to ask very specific questions about the origins of Caldwell Global's recent success. Alvarez opened the folder. His expression changed the moment he began to read. Slowly, like a man watching weather shift. Strategy memos, market analyses, expansion frameworks, all bearing Meline's digital signature, all time-stamped weeks or months before their implementation at Caldwell Global. The full architecture of Ethan's celebrated vision laid out in the handwriting of someone who had never received a single line of credit for building it. He read for a long moment in silence. This is extraordinary work, he said finally quietly, almost to himself. Whoever created these strategies understands European market dynamics better than anyone I've encountered. Thank you, Meline said. I worked very hard on them. Alvarez looked up sharply. You're the architect, he said. I am, and Caldwell has been passing them off as his own, not just passing them off, building his entire reputation on them, while keeping me completely out of sight. Alvarez closed the folder slowly. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that sat somewhere between calculation and something closer to genuine respect. Why come to me with this? He asked. Why not simply expose him yourself? Because exposure isn't enough. Her voice was steady, and underneath it ran a current of steel she no longer tried to conceal. I don't want to be a whistleblower. I don't want to be a scorned woman telling her side of the story. I want to reclaim my professional identity in a way that cannot be dismissed or diminished. And that requires the right stage, the right audience, the right moment. The Gala, Alvarez said. The Gala, she confirmed. He was quiet for another long moment. Then he extended his hand across the table. You have my support, Ms. Morrow. A pause. Or should I say Mrs. Caldwell? Meline shook his hand and did not correct him. Not yet. 1 week before the gala, Meline made a call she had been rehearsing for years without realizing it. Margaret Chen had been her mentor at Patterson and Rhodes, the sharpest legal mind Meline had ever encountered, a woman who could read a case the way other people read faces, with an intuitive precision that came from decades of paying absolute attention. She was now a senior partner specializing in intellectual property and divorce litigation. Meline had calculated exactly the person she needed. They met for lunch at Margaret's favorite restaurant, a quiet place where attorneys talked strategy over wine that cost more than it had any right to. Meline Carter, Margaret said, embracing her at the door with genuine warmth. It's been too long. When you left the firm, I thought you'd disappear into domestic bliss forever. Things change, Meline said simply. They ordered. And then Meline laid out the situation with the clinical precision of a litigator who has prepared her case and is no longer afraid of it. The affair, the intellectual property theft, Ethan's documented plan to divorce her while positioning her as someone who had contributed nothing to the company she had built. Margaret listened without interrupting. Her expression traveled through surprise, through recognition, through a sharpening focus that Meline recognized as the face of a lawyer who has just identified a genuinely exceptional case. "How much documentation do you have?" she asked when Meline finished. Meline pulled out her tablet and showed her. Margaret scrolled through the files in silence. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she looked up. "This is bulletproof," she said. "With a paper trail like this, you could claim substantial ownership in Caldwell Global, possibly majority ownership if we can prove you were the primary strategic architect during the growth phase." "That's exactly what I need." Meline took a sip of wine. "But I need the filing to be perfectly timed. The Monday after the International Trade Council Gala. I want the divorce papers and the intellectual property claim filed simultaneously before he has a chance to hide assets or construct a counter-narrative." Margaret's eyes gleamed with the particular light of a lawyer who has just been given an elegant problem to solve. "You're not just leaving him," she said. "You're dismantling him." "I'm reclaiming what's mine," Meline corrected. "Everything else is just consequence." Margaret nodded slowly. "I'll have everything prepared, papers ready to file the moment you give the word." She paused, and something softened in her expression. "But Meline, are you sure?" "Once we start this process, there's no going back. Your marriage will be over. Things will get very ugly very quickly." Meline thought about the past 8 years. The contracts drafted in a converted guest room while Ethan networked at dinners she hadn't been invited to. The strategies she had built from nothing that had become his executive vision. The slow, steady erosion of everything she had once been: the attorney, the strategist, the woman who had walked into courtrooms and changed outcomes. She thought about those words on his phone screen glowing in the November dark. "Make sure she can't claim any ownership when we divorce." "I've never been more sure of anything," she said. Margaret reached across the table and covered her hand. "Then let's make sure you win," she said. The night before the gala, Ethan paced their bedroom with electric energy, talking through investor names, rehearsing talking points, conducting himself like a man preparing to receive something he believed he had earned. Meline sat at her vanity and watched him in the mirror and felt something strange and final settle over her, like the last act of a play she had been inside for so long she had forgotten there was an audience. "This is going to be huge," he said, not looking at her. "Morrison told me there are 3 major international investors attending specifically for expansion conversations. If I can close even one of those deals, we're looking at doubling our European presence." "That's wonderful," Meline said. "The strategy for European expansion, the one we developed—" He paused. A small hesitation. Then he kept going. "It's solid. They're going to love it." "The one we developed." She watched his face in the mirror, watched him choose that word and move past it and not even register that it had cost her anything. "Ethan," she said, her voice gentle and curious, careful as a scalpel. "Do you ever think about what I gave up for you? For the company?" He looked confused, as though the question had arrived in a language he had never learned. "What do you mean?" "My career, my partnership track at Patterson and Rhodes, my professional identity." She turned in her chair to face him directly, her hands in her lap, her expression mild. "Do you ever think about what that cost me?" He was quiet for a moment. His hands had stilled on the jacket he had been adjusting. "I think you made a choice," he said carefully. "To support our family, to build something together." "Did I build something?" she said. "Or did I build something for you?" The silence stretched. Then he crossed to her, took her hand, pressed it with the warmth of a man who knew how to press a hand. "Where's this coming from?" "Nowhere." She stood, releasing his hand, smoothing her robe. "I've just been thinking about the future, about what comes next." "What comes next is we keep building," he said, relief audible in his voice. "Together, like we always have." "Together," Meline echoed. She kissed him on the cheek and went to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror with the door closed and looked at the woman she had almost been willing to remain. Tomorrow night, that woman was going to walk into the most important room in their industry, and Ethan Caldwell was finally going to see her. She did not sleep. She had not expected to sleep. She lay beside him in the dark, listening to his breathing slow and deepen, and she ran through the plan the way she had run through closing arguments in her litigation years, identifying every pressure point, every variable, every place where something could go wrong and what she would do if it did. The plan was clean. She had built it the way she built everything from the ground up with rigor, with attention to the details that most people overlooked because they were too busy looking at the headline. She had learned years ago that the headline was usually where people hid their weaknesses. The truth lived in the footnotes. She had documentation that proved she was the primary author of every major strategic initiative Caldwell Global had implemented since its expansion began. She had Victor Alvarez as a witness to her expertise and a platform to surface it. She had Margaret Chen with papers ready to file the moment the gala was over. And this was the part she had not told anyone, the card she held closest, something else. She had years of being underestimated. Ethan had spent 8 years believing her compliance was agreement, that her silence was acceptance, that the woman who worked quietly in the converted guest room and never demanded credit was a woman who had simply decided that credit didn't matter to her. He had confused invisibility with weakness. He had confused her patience with absence of ambition. He had looked at the meticulous, tireless work she produced night after night after night, and concluded that a person who worked that hard without complaint must simply not want anything more than to be useful. That was his fatal error. She had wanted everything. She had always wanted everything. She had simply been waiting for the moment when demanding it would cost him more than it cost her. That moment was tomorrow. The Alvarez dinner had been 3 days ago. She still thought about the way Victor had read through her documentation, the careful stillness that fell over him, the shift in his expression from professional courtesy to something approaching genuine awe. These strategies are not derivative, he had said near the end of their meeting after he had read through the full portfolio. He had the manner of a man thinking aloud, speaking to himself as much as to her. They're not iterations on existing models. Someone developed original analytical frameworks here. Someone looked at these European markets and saw structural patterns that no one in our industry had mapped before. He looked at her. How did you develop the German market entry model? The approach to the regulatory compliance matrix, I've never seen that structure anywhere else. 18 months of research, she said. I mapped every major regulatory body in the German trade sector, identified where their oversight functions overlapped and where they conflicted, and built a compliance pathway that navigated both without creating unnecessary exposure. The framework is designed to flex as regulations shift, so it doesn't require full reconstruction every time the political environment changes. Victor was quiet for a moment. Ethan presented that as his proprietary methodology at the Hamburg summit last year. I know, Meline said. I watched the video. There had been a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that falls when two intelligent people arrive at the same understanding simultaneously and find they don't need words for it. I have to ask you something, Victor said finally. Why didn't you leave sooner? Once you understood what was happening, once it became clear that he was never going to give you credit, why did you stay? Meline had considered the question. She had considered it before in the small hours of many nights with less clarity than she had now. Because I believed in the work, she said. Even when I stopped believing in him, I believed in what we were building. The European expansion framework isn't just a corporate strategy. It's a genuine model for how international trade partnerships can be built ethically with real respect for local markets and local labor. I knew it was good. I knew it was working. And some part of me thought that if it worked well enough, eventually it would become impossible to pretend I hadn't built it. But he just kept pretending. He just kept pretending. She had looked at her hands on the table. Steady. Always steady. And by the time I understood that he was never going to stop, I had already given so much that the idea of walking away felt like losing everything. It took me a long time to realize that staying was also losing everything, just more slowly, and quietly enough that no one would notice, including me. Victor nodded. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read, a private recognition, as though her words had found a specific place in him that had been waiting to receive them. My support is unconditional, he said. Whatever you need at the gala. The morning of the gala. Meline woke before dawn and went to her office. She sat at her desk for a long time without turning on the lamp. The room was dark except for the ambient gray light coming through the window, the particular pre-dawn light of November neutral and without judgment. She thought about the woman who had sat at this desk and done this work for 5 years. She thought about the Jakarta contract and the German market entry model and the French distribution partnership framework and the 40 other strategic documents she had built in this room in the quiet of afternoons when Ethan was at investor lunches and board presentations. She thought about the particular silence of a house that is supposed to be shared but has come to feel like solitary confinement. She did not feel sorry for herself. She had gotten past that phase weeks ago, somewhere in the process of building her case, and she did not think she was going back. But she wanted to honor the weight of it, the specific cost of what she had given up before she went into that ballroom and demanded its return. She had been good at her career, not just competent good in the way that mattered, in the way that had made partners at the firm sit up and take notice, the way that had put her on track for partnership at 32. She had loved the courtroom in the way some people love the ocean for its scale, its demand for complete attention, the way it forced you to be more than you thought you could be. She had walked away from all of it because she had believed in Ethan's vision and believed in him and believed in the version of partnership he had promised her. "Your name will be on this too," he had said, 5 years ago, in this room. Looking at the business plan she had helped him restructure over 3 successive weekends. "We'll be partners in everything." She had believed him. That was the thing about Ethan Caldwell she had never quite been able to reconcile. He was not, she thought, a man who had set out to steal from her. He was a man who had wanted what she offered and taken it, and then gradually, almost imperceptibly, had constructed a story in which that taking was entirely natural, entirely reciprocal, entirely fair. He had not deceived her so much as he had deceived himself, and then asked her to live inside his self-deception as though it were a home they had built together. That was perhaps the most insidious kind of theft. She turned on her desk lamp. She looked at the framed quote she had hung on the wall when she first moved into this space, a line from a speech delivered by a federal judge she had admired in law school. "The law does not reward silence. It rewards evidence." She had the evidence. Tonight she was done being silent. Ethan knocked on the office door at 9 already in his tuxedo, already performing the role he had spent 8 years perfecting. "You're up early," he said, leaning against the doorframe, with the ease of a man who has never questioned his right to be comfortable anywhere. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Excited about tonight." He smiled, warm, genuine, or close enough to genuine that the difference had stopped mattering. "Me too. Big night." He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been tenderness. "You're going to look incredible. Whatever you're planning to wear." "I hope so," Meline said. He blew her a kiss from the doorway and went to make coffee, humming something under his breath. Confident, light, entirely unaware that the woman sitting at the desk in the corner had already determined everything that was about to happen to him. She listened to him in the kitchen. She listened to the coffee maker, to the particular sounds of his morning, to the life they had built together in this house. She was going to leave before the week was out. She was not sad. She was precise. And in a few hours, at the Grand Meridian Hotel, under crystal chandeliers and in front of 300 of the most influential people in their industry, Meline Carter was going to stop being invisible. She was going to step into the light and say her name. And the world was going to have to reckon with the fact that it had been looking at her work for 5 years without ever being told who had done it. The Grand Meridian Hotel had been designed to make people feel small in the most flattering possible way. Its lobby soared 40 feet toward a ceiling painted in the style of the Italian Renaissance allegories of commerce and ambition, rendered in gilt and cerulean, surrounded by crystal chandeliers so large they required their own structural support. The marble floors reflected everything: the men in black tie, the women in their gowns, the constant flicker of champagne flutes caught in light. It was a room built for the specific theatrical purpose of making whoever entered it believe that something important was about to happen to them. Meline arrived at 7:14 p.m. She had taken a different route than Ethan. She had told him she needed to stop at her sister's house first. A sister who did not exist. He had not questioned it. He had kissed her cheek in the lobby of their building, told her he'd see her inside, and driven off in the town car with his professional smile already in place. She checked into a room on the hotel's 5th floor under the name Meline Morrow. She set her clutch on the bed inside it, her phone, her lipstick, and a flash drive containing copies of every document in her encrypted portfolio, and then she stood in front of the full-length mirror and took a long, measuring look at the woman she had decided to become. The emerald dress moved when she moved. The dark lipstick was composed and absolute. Her eyes, framed in shadow, looked like they had been practicing patience for years and were done with it. She thought, he is going to see me tonight, and he is not going to understand what he is looking at. She thought, that is the last advantage I have, and I intend to use every second of it. She took the service elevator down to avoid the main lobby. She needed to arrive in the ballroom in a particular way through a particular door at a particular moment. Victor Alvarez was waiting for her near the east entrance exactly as they had arranged. He wore a dark suit that cost what some people made in a month, and carried himself with the relaxed authority of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He looked at her when she approached, and his expression shifted in a way that told her everything she needed to know about how she appeared. "Ms. Morrow," he said, offering his arm, "you look like someone who owns this room." "Not yet," Meline said, taking his arm. "But I will." The ballroom was spectacular in the way of spaces that have been specifically engineered to inspire awe. 2,000 square feet of polished marble floor, crystal chandeliers suspended from 30-foot ceilings, tables arranged with the geometric precision of an exhibition, each one dressed in white linen and candlelight. At the far end, a raised stage with a podium and a row of chairs for the evening's panel discussion. 300 guests in formal attire, moving through the space in the patterns of their ambition, clustering, dispersing, reforming around new combinations of money and influence, the invisible currents of power flowing beneath the surface of champagne and polite conversation. Meline spotted Ethan within 30 seconds of entering the room. He stood near the center, the social center, the place where the most important conversations were most likely to happen. Wearing the tuxedo she had helped him select 3 years ago for an occasion she could no longer remember. At his side was a woman Meline recognized from photographs she had found in the company's shared drive, Chloe Bennett, 24 years old, blonde, polished in the particular way of someone who has recently invested heavily in looking older than she is. In person, she looked younger than Meline had expected. She was laughing at something Ethan said, her hand on his arm, with the ease of a woman who believed she had a right to be there. And Meline felt something strange and purely observational move through her, not jealousy. Nothing as messy as jealousy, but a cold, clear recognition. This is what I was being replaced with. Not malice, not brilliance, just novelty. Just the particular appeal of someone who had not yet had the chance to become inconvenient. "Half the room is already watching us," Victor murmured, his hand resting lightly on her arm as they moved through the crowd. "Good," Meline said. "Let them." They moved deliberately through the room, not rushing, not performing haste, simply moving through the space with the ease of people who belong in it entirely. Meline could feel eyes tracking them. She could feel the subtle recalibration happening in clusters of conversation as people registered Victor Alvarez, a known quantity, a respected name, and his companion who was neither known nor recognizable and therefore immediately interesting. She caught Ethan's eye across the room. The sequence of his expressions lasted perhaps 4 seconds. First, confusion. A beautiful woman entering on Victor Alvarez's arm, moving with complete confidence, familiar in some quality she couldn't immediately identify. Then a flicker of deeper recognition, something stirring beneath the surface. Then the full arrival of understanding hitting him like a physical impact, his body registering it before his face did. His shoulders going rigid under the impeccable tuxedo, his jaw locking, his eyes going wide for one unguarded moment before he mastered himself and looked away. Meline had looked away before he did. She was already smiling at the cluster of European investors Victor was steering her toward. Klaus Wehrer was a silver-haired German in his mid-60s who had made his fortune in Eastern European logistics and had the particular air of a man who had heard every pitch and been impressed by very few of them. He greeted Victor with warm familiarity and turned to Meline with the polite curiosity of a man who had learned long ago that interesting people often arrived without introduction. "Miss Morrow specializes in international trade strategy," Victor said. "European market dynamics in particular. She's been consulting with the Beaumont Investment Consortium out of Geneva. Meline extended her hand. Her grip was firm. Her smile was specific. Not social, not performative, but the smile of someone who has just identified something genuinely worth her attention. Mr. Verer, she said, I've been following your work in the Polish logistics sector. The partnership structure you developed for the Warsaw distribution network was particularly elegant. You managed to navigate the regulatory overlap between municipal and national oversight in a way that most operators in that market either haven't attempted or haven't succeeded at. Verer's eyebrows rose. Not just politely, genuinely. You've done your research. I make it my practice to understand the key players in any market I'm analyzing, she said. I believe in understanding not just the numbers, but the cultural and political context that drives them. In the Polish case, the challenge isn't regulatory, it's relational. The national framework technically supersedes the municipal, but in practice, the municipal relationships determine whether anything actually moves. That is, Verer paused, recalibrating. That is precisely correct, and it is not a distinction that many people in this industry make, even those with direct experience in that market. He studied her with the frank attention of someone who has stopped pretending interest and arrived at genuine curiosity. Where did you develop this understanding? Years of close study, Meline said, which was entirely true. The conversation gathered momentum. The other investors in the cluster leaned in, and Meline moved through their questions with the fluency of someone for whom this knowledge was not acquired but constitutive. Not a set of facts she had memorized, but a way of seeing the world she had built brick by brick in a converted guest room while her husband attended dinners in her absence. She talked about tariff structures and their relationship to diplomatic cycles. She talked about the difference between regulatory compliance and regulatory integration, how the most successful international partnerships didn't just satisfy the letter of local law, but built genuine relationships with the regulatory bodies themselves. She talked about the patterns she had identified in European market behavior over the past decade, patterns that had informed the specific framework she had developed for Caldwell Global's expansion strategy. She did not mention Caldwell Global by name. She did not need to. Your analysis sounds remarkably similar, one of the investors said after a while, an American named Bradford, sharp-faced and direct, to some of the strategic frameworks I've seen coming out of Caldwell Global. Are you familiar with their approach? Meline's smile did not waver. I'm familiar with their work, yes, though I'd say it's less that I sound like them and more that they've implemented certain strategies that follow established best practices. Established by whom? By people who understand that successful international expansion requires more than aggressive ambition, she said. It requires detailed market analysis, cultural sensitivity, and a willingness to build genuine partnerships rather than simply extracting value from local markets. In her peripheral vision, she could see Ethan moving toward them across the ballroom. Victor caught her eye briefly, the smallest nod. Excuse me, Ethan said, arriving at the edge of the cluster with his professional smile deployed at full power and his eyes doing something entirely different. Victor, good to see you. He shook Victor's hand. Then he turned to Meline, and for one unguarded moment his face did something complicated and involuntary. Meline, I thought you were meeting me at the entrance. Change of plans, she said pleasantly. I ran into Mr. Alvarez at the hotel. He was kind enough to escort me in. You know how overwhelming these events can be when you arrive alone. He stopped, recovered. Of course. Yes. He gestured toward Chloe, who had materialized at his elbow with the expression of a woman who is performing comfort she does not entirely feel. Have you met Chloe Bennett? Meline said. Your executive assistant. I know. She offered a brief, clean handshake. Meline Carter, though I prefer Morrow in professional settings. Chloe's smile flickered. Ethan's told me so much about you. Has he? Meline said. How interesting. He's barely mentioned you at all. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough. Chloe's smile became a different kind of smile. Ethan's jaw tightened. Victor examined a point just above the far wall with the neutral expression of a man at a chess match who has no horse in the race and is simply watching the board. Meline. Ethan's voice had dropped low, controlled, doing the work of managing a situation before it became visible to the people around them. Can I speak with you privately just for a moment? Of course, she said. He guided her to a quieter corner of the ballroom behind an elaborate arrangement of white orchids that served as a partial partition. Chloe followed, hovering uncertainly close enough to hear, but clearly unsure whether she was supposed to be there. Ethan waited until they were clear of the main flow of conversation before he turned to her. The professional smile was gone. What replaced it was something rawer and harder. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I invited you here as my wife, not as whatever." He gestured at the transformation, at the emerald silk and the dark lipstick and the composed, absolute woman who had walked into his gala on his biggest competitor's arm. "Whatever this is." "I'm still your wife, Ethan," she said. "I'm just also a professional. Is there something wrong with that?" "You were discussing strategic frameworks with my investors." "I was having a conversation about international trade," she said, "which I am qualified to have. I have a law degree from Columbia and spent 6 years in corporate litigation before I chose to support your vision. Did you forget that?" "I didn't forget anything." He glanced at Chloe, a flicker of something she couldn't entirely read. "I just didn't expect—" "What didn't you expect?" He didn't answer. "What didn't you expect, Ethan?" "That I would be capable of walking into this room and being someone that I would have things to say that people wanted to hear. That's not— Or did you not expect me to arrive with someone else?" She tilted her head slightly. "Did you assume I would be at home in my office revising something that would eventually have your name on it?" The color in his face shifted. His jaw tightened further. For a moment she could see the machinery behind the charm, the calculation, the adjustment, the rapid assembly of a new strategy in real time. "We should talk about this at home," he said. His voice had gone careful and flat, the tone of someone diffusing without admitting there is anything to diffuse. "Right now I need you to dial this back. These people are important." "To your business," she said. He looked at her. "To our business." "Right." She smoothed the emerald silk with one hand. "How could I forget?" She stepped back, clean unhurried. "Enjoy your evening, Ethan. I'm sure you and Miss Bennett have a great deal of networking to accomplish." She turned and walked away before he could respond. She heard Chloe's voice behind her, hushed, uncertain, "What just happened?" She did not look back. Victor found her at the bar. Her fingers curled around a champagne flute she had no intention of drinking. She just needed something to hold while her heart ran its own private sprint behind the composed surface she was maintaining with every trained instinct she possessed. "That looked intense," he observed, accepting a glass of his own from the bartender. "He's rattled," she said quietly. "Good." Half the room watched that exchange. Victor scanned the ballroom with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to reading crowds. No one could hear it, but everyone noticed. The body language alone— He paused. "People are going to be paying very close attention to whatever happens next." "Then let's make sure the next thing is worth watching." The lights in the ballroom flickered twice the signal that the formal program was beginning. Around them, the crowd began its collective migration toward the rows of chairs arranged before the stage. Meline and Victor moved with the flow, finding seats in the third row, close enough to see every expression on the faces of the panelists, far enough back to maintain the angle of observers rather than participants. For now, Ethan mounted the stage with the other 3 panelists, all recognized figures in international commerce. All men who had built their reputations on the exact kind of strategic vision that Meline had quietly been providing to one of them for 5 years. He looked comfortable up there. Of course he did. He had been rehearsing for this panel with her help for 3 weeks. The moderator, a respected business journalist named Patricia Hammond, introduced each panelist in turn. When she reached Ethan, she read from his prepared biography with the kind of fluency that suggested she found it genuinely impressive. "Ethan Caldwell has revolutionized Caldwell Global's approach to European market expansion," Patricia said, "implementing innovative strategies that have become industry benchmarks for ethical and effective international trade." Meline's fingers tightened on the stem of her champagne flute. Beside her, Victor leaned slightly closer. "Patience," he said quietly. "Your moment is coming." The panel discussion began with the broad, comfortable territory of international trade trends and regulatory outlook questions that allowed each panelist to sound authoritative without saying anything that would cost them anything. Ethan answered with the fluency of a man who had internalized the talking points so thoroughly that they now felt like his own thinking. He spoke about transparency and partnership and respect for local markets with the conviction of someone who had never questioned the origin of those ideas. Meline watched him from the third row and felt something very quiet and very cold settle in the center of her chest. It was 20 minutes before Patricia Hammond shifted the frame. "I'd like to discuss something that's been generating increasing attention in our industry," she said, her tone acquiring the deliberate quality of a journalist who has decided to go somewhere specific. "The question of intellectual property and proper attribution in corporate strategy. We've seen several high-profile cases where innovative approaches were developed by people who never received credit for them. Mr. Alvarez, you've been vocal about this issue. Can you speak to why you believe proper attribution matters?" Victor leaned forward in his chair on stage, his expression thoughtful and unhurried. "It matters because trust is the foundation of international business," he said. "When we misrepresent the origins of our strategies, when we take credit for work we didn't do, we're not just being unethical in the abstract. We're corroding the very foundation that makes cross-cultural commerce possible. Trust is the currency of international trade. It's worth more than any single deal." "Can you give us a concrete example?" Patricia pressed. "Several," Victor said. "I've seen companies claim proprietary methodologies that were developed by uncredited consultants. I've seen executives build entire reputations on white papers and analyses authored by people whose names never appeared in any public documentation. I've seen the architects of genuine strategic innovation rendered invisible, while the people who implemented their work took the stage." A murmur moved through the audience, the particular sound of a crowd that has recognized something being said that is usually not said in rooms like this one. Patricia turned to Ethan. "Mr. Caldwell, your company has been particularly successful in recent years. How do you ensure proper attribution of strategic innovation at Caldwell Global?" Ethan's smile was as smooth and practiced as a practiced smile gets. "Absolutely, Patricia. We have a rigorous internal review process. Every major strategic initiative is vetted through our executive team, and we make sure to recognize the contributions of everyone involved, and including non-executive contributors." Victor asked the question, arriving with the softness of something that had been waiting in its place for a long time. "Consultants, perhaps. Support staff who might be developing strategic frameworks outside the formal structure of the organization." A flash of something moved through Ethan's eyes, controlled, suppressed, but present. "Of course. We believe in collaborative development. Great strategies come from great teams." "Do you publicly acknowledge the specific individuals who developed those strategies?" Victor continued. "Or does the credit typically flow upward to the executive level?" "I think that's a false dichotomy," Ethan said. His tone was still pleasant, but there was an edge beneath it now that the people paying close attention would hear. "In collaborative environments, it's often genuinely impossible to attribute specific ideas to specific individuals. Strategies evolve through conversation and iteration. But someone usually originates the core framework," Victor said, patient as a surgeon. "Someone does the actual analytical work, develops the initial models, creates the intellectual architecture that others then build upon. Don't they deserve recognition for that foundational contribution?" "In theory, yes. In practice," Patricia interjected, leaning forward with the energy of a journalist who has found her thread. "In practice," Victor finished quietly, "it's easier to let the executive take credit for work done by someone who isn't in the room." The ballroom had gone still. Not silent, 300 people don't simply go silent, but still in a different way, the way a room goes still when it recognizes that something real is happening in it. Patricia tried to redirect. "This is clearly a passionate topic. Mr. Caldwell, can you speak specifically? Can you name them?" The voice came from the third row. Meline stood. 300 people turned. The stage turned. Ethan turned. And for a moment, one suspended crystalline moment that she would remember with precision. For the rest of her life, the entire room held its breath together, waiting to understand what was about to happen. Meline had prepared for this moment the way she had prepared for every important performance of her professional life, with exhaustive research, precise planning, and then at the crucial instant, the complete surrender of planning to presence. She did not consult her notes. She did not review her talking points. She simply stood in the light and spoke. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice carrying with the effortless projection of someone trained in courtrooms. "But Mr. Caldwell just spoke about valuing every member of his organization and the collective effort behind his company's success. I'm curious whether he can name the individuals who developed the European expansion framework he referenced earlier, the one that's become an industry benchmark." Patricia leaned forward from the stage, shielding her eyes from the lights. "And you are?" "My name is Meline Carter," she said clearly. "That's my professional name, my maiden name. My married name is Caldwell." The sound that moved through the room was unlike anything she had heard before. Not a gasp more complex than a gasp, a collective intake of understanding, a crowd, absorbing information and rearranging everything it had thought it was watching. On stage, Ethan Caldwell had gone the color of marble. "I'm also." Meline continued, her voice steady and clean in the sudden near silence. "The person who developed the European expansion framework Mr. Caldwell has built his reputation on. Along with most of the other strategic initiatives Caldwell Global has implemented over the past 5 years. That's..." Ethan started to stand. Patricia put a hand out, a small, firm gesture, and he stopped. "Miss Carter?" Patricia's journalist instincts had fully engaged, and her voice was careful and precise. "Those are significant claims. Do you have evidence to support them?" Meline reached into her clutch and produced the flash drive. "I have comprehensive documentation," she said. "Dated files showing the development of every major strategy Caldwell Global has implemented. Market analyses, contract frameworks, expansion models, all authored by me, all implemented without attribution." She held the flash drive up, not theatrically, but simply the way you hold up evidence. "I'd be happy to share this with anyone interested in examining the question of intellectual property rights in our industry. It makes for a fascinating case study in how brilliance can be systematically erased when it becomes convenient to erase it." The room had arrived at a quality of silence she had only experienced once before in her life in a courtroom, at the moment when the jury foreman was about to speak the verdict. Ethan had found his voice. "Meline," the word came out scraped raw. "These are wild accusations. Based on 5 years of comprehensive documentation," she said. "Based on contracts I wrote, analyses I conducted, strategies I developed in a home office while you took credit in boardrooms at events exactly like this one. You helped. Did I..." Her voice was soft now, which made it carry further. "Because I don't remember you mentioning my name once in any public forum. I don't remember seeing my name on any byline or presentation or strategic document. I remember working until 3 in the morning on expansion models that you presented as your executive vision. I remember writing contracts that bore your signature instead of mine. I remember you asking me to simplify the language of a 47-page analysis I had spent 4 days developing so it would sound like it came from a business magazine instead of a Columbia-trained attorney." She looked at him across the 3 rows and the stage and the 8 years. "I remember," she said quietly, "you telling me I was brilliant every time you needed something, and I remember you never once telling anyone else." The stillness in the room was absolute. Then Victor Alvarez spoke from the stage, and his voice was steady and clear and carried the weight of a man who means every word he says. "Mr. Caldwell, did your wife contribute to your company's strategic development, or didn't she..." Ethan's mouth opened, closed. He looked like a man standing in a room where all the exits have simultaneously disappeared. "She contributed," he said finally. The words came out hollow. "Of course she contributed. But the ideas were collaborative," Victor pressed gently. "I have emails," Meline said, "where you asked me to develop specific strategies, drafts bearing my edits and my analytical frameworks. Timestamped documents proving that every major initiative came from my research, my analysis, my strategic vision." She paused. "And I have proof that while you were building Caldwell Global's reputation, I was building Caldwell Global's strategy. and that you systematically erased my contributions while planning to divorce me and ensure I couldn't claim any ownership of the company my work created. That last sentence landed like something dropped from a great height. Across the room at the edge of the stage, Chloe Bennett had gone white. Ethan stared at Meline, and in his face she could see the precise moment when he understood that there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to deflect, nothing left between him and the full truth of what he had done. "I've seen the messages, Ethan," Meline said. Her voice was quiet now, almost gentle, and somehow that made it worse. "The ones where you discuss making sure I can't claim ownership when you finally end our marriage. The ones where you call me complicated. Where you plan very carefully to ensure that when you're ready to move on with someone younger, someone who looks better on your arm at events like this one, you can walk away with everything my work built while I'm left with nothing." From the edge of the stage, audible in the silence, a small broken sound. Chloe Bennett's hand covered her mouth. Her eyes were moving between Ethan and Meline with the specific horror of a person who is only now understanding the full dimensions of the story she has been living inside. "You said the marriage was over," Chloe whispered, loud enough in the silence. "You said she knew, Chloe." Ethan's voice cracked on her name. "You said she was fine with it." Chloe's voice cracked too differently with the particular desolation of someone watching a story collapse. "You said I wasn't a secret, I think," Patricia Hammond said into her microphone with the tone of a journalist who is simultaneously managing a live situation and experiencing the professional event of her career. "We should perhaps—" "No." Meline's voice was clear and final. "I don't need a recess. I need everyone in this room to understand what happened here. I need the industry that celebrated Ethan Caldwell as a strategic genius to know that the strategies came from someone else. Someone he kept hidden. Someone he planned to discard the moment she outlived her usefulness." She looked directly at him then, and for the first time that evening she let him see what lived behind the composed exterior. Not hatred, not grief, but something colder and more permanent than either. "You took my career," she said. "You took my professional identity. You took years of my life and my brilliance, and you used them to build something that bore only your name. And you did it while making me believe we were building it together. We are partners," he said. The desperation was fully audible now, the professional armor completely gone, just a man standing on a stage watching his life dismantle itself in real time. "Meline, please. We can talk about this privately." "We are done talking privately," she said. "We are done with me working in the shadows while you stand in the spotlight. We are done with your lies and your manipulation and your systematic erasure of everything I contributed." She turned to address the room, all 300 of them, the journalists already reaching for their phones, the investors already leaning together, the entire industry that had gathered here to celebrate people like Ethan Caldwell, and had instead found itself witnessing the moment one of them was finally made to account. "My name is Meline Carter," she said. Her voice rang through the ballroom, clear and certain and entirely her own. "I have a law degree from Columbia University and 6 years of experience in corporate litigation. I have spent the past 5 years developing the strategic frameworks that transformed Caldwell Global from a regional importer into an international presence. And starting Monday, I will be filing for divorce and claiming my rightful ownership of the intellectual property I created." The room erupted. "What?" Questions came from every direction at once. Journalists were already on their phones. Investors clustered in urgent, low-voiced conferences. The formal order of the gala, the program, the dinner, the carefully orchestrated sequence of professional theater dissolved into something raw and entirely unscripted. Meline stood at the center of it and felt something she had not felt in years. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter and more essential than either. She felt known. Victor appeared at her side and offered his arm with the calm of a man who had anticipated this moment and found it precisely as expected. "Shall we?" he said quietly. Meline placed her hand on his arm. She took one look back at Ethan, still on the stage, motionless, his professional world folding in around him, and then she turned and walked out of the ballroom with her head up and her heels clicking against the marble with the sound of something finally irrevocably decided. Behind her, she heard him call her name. She did not turn back. The cameras were waiting outside. The flashbulbs erupted the moment she and Victor stepped through the Grand Meridian's revolving doors into the cold November air. Journalists had assembled with the speed of people who had been watching a live stream and understood that the moment they were witnessing was the kind that required physical presence. They pressed forward in a wall of shouted questions and extended microphones, their voices layering into each other until the individual words lost meaning and only the urgency remained. Miss Carter, is it true you developed all of Caldwell Global's European strategies? How long have you known about the affair? Are you filing for divorce? Ms. Marrow, or is it Carter, can you comment on your allegations? Victor's driver had the car waiting. He opened the door and Meline slid inside, grateful for the sudden insulated quiet for the tinted windows that reduced the surging crowd to a blur of motion and light. Victor settled in beside her. The door closed. The city reorganized itself into something she could breathe in. That went well, Victor said dryly. Meline laughed. The sound surprised her, slightly too high-edged with adrenaline, the laughter of someone who has been holding something enormous for a very long time and has only just set it down. I'm not sure well is the word I'd use, she said. I just destroyed my husband's career in front of 300 people. You exposed the truth in front of 300 people, Victor said. There's a difference. He was already scrolling through his phone, his expression moving through rapid professional assessment. My assistant says Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Financial Times all have the story in the last 20 minutes. That fast. That's the thing about truth bombs at high-profile events? Victor said something close to admiration in his voice. Everyone in that room had a phone and a platform. Your revelation was viral before you'd finished speaking. Meline's own phone had been vibrating in her clutch since approximately the moment she had stood up. She pulled it out now and looked at the screen, a cascade of notifications that had been accumulating in real-time texts, emails, missed calls, numbers she recognized, and dozens she didn't. One message cut through the noise. Margaret Chen sent 4 minutes ago. I watched the live stream. Brilliant execution. Come to my office first thing tomorrow morning. We need to move before he has time to hide assets. Also, you're trending. Welcome to the next phase of your life. Meline showed the message to Victor, who read it, and laughed a genuine full sound. Not the polished professional chuckle of a man managing a relationship, but the real laugh of someone who is genuinely pleased. Margaret's right, he said. By tomorrow morning, you'll be the most talked about woman in international business. Meline looked out the window at the city moving past all those lights, all those lives, all those people moving through the November dark toward whatever they were building or dismantling or beginning. She thought about the woman who had sat in a converted guest room for 5 years producing brilliant work in silence and tried to locate her somewhere inside herself. She couldn't quite find her. That woman felt very far away. Are you prepared for what comes next? Victor asked. What comes next? Scrutiny, he said plainly. Every aspect of your marriage, your work, your claims, all of it will be examined. Ethan isn't going to accept this quietly. He'll fight back. He'll claim you're exaggerating or that this is the behavior of a woman experiencing emotional distress. He'll do everything within his power to discredit what you've said tonight. Meline felt something harden in her chest. Not anger, just resolution. The same quality of material. Let him try, she said. I have documentation. 5 years of it, time-stamped files, email chains, everything anyone would need to verify every claim I made tonight. Victor nodded. Good, because this is war now. Corporate war, legal war, public relations war. Are you ready for all of it? She thought about the past 8 years, the quiet erosion accumulating so gradually she hadn't felt it until she couldn't remember what it had felt like before it started. The moment in the bedroom with his phone in her hand, the long, cold night of building Project Reclamation, the meetings with Victor and Margaret, and the careful, deliberate construction of a reckoning. I've been preparing for this my entire marriage, she said quietly. I just didn't know it until 2 weeks ago. The car pulled up to a boutique hotel in the financial district, not the one where Meline had checked in earlier. Victor had arranged an alternate property as a precaution. Journalists or Ethan himself might track her to her original location. Get some rest, he said as they stood in the lobby. Tomorrow is going to require everything you have. She thanked him genuinely with the kind of gratitude that goes past words, and has to trust the words anyway. For the alliance, for the risk he had taken in supporting her, for the fact that he had believed her when she had still been Meline Marrow, a name she had borrowed from herself. After he left, she rode the elevator to her room in a state that was not quite exhaustion and not quite relief, but something suspended between them. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was metabolizing, leaving behind a cellular weariness and the first tremors of genuine emotional reckoning with what she had just done. She had stood in a ballroom and said the truest thing she had ever said in public. She had said her name. She had said what she had built, and why it mattered, and what it had cost her, and what she intended to take back. She had done something terrifying and necessary, and she had done it without flinching, and she was still here. That felt in this quiet hotel room with the city lights glittering outside like more than she had known she was capable of. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Meline. Ethan's voice raw scraped nothing left of the professional polish. Just the voice of a man calling in the aftermath of something he understood couldn't be undone. You shouldn't be calling me, she said. Her own voice was calm. She put the phone on speaker and continued removing the emerald dress, unhooking the diamond earrings her grandmother had left her. Lawyers, Meline, after everything. Anything you need to say should go through lawyers, she said. That's not a threat. That's just what's appropriate now. You humiliated me in front of the entire industry. His voice cracked on the word. After everything I've done for you. After everything I've done for you, she corrected quietly. I believe you have the direction of that sentence reversed. I built this company. You built it on a foundation I designed, she said. You secured the funding, yes. You managed the client relationships, yes. You made the calls and attended the dinners and showed up in the rooms where decisions were made. But the decisions you made were based on strategic frameworks I developed. The funding you secured was attracted by exponential growth built on my expansion models. You didn't execute a vision, Ethan. You took one. Silence. What do you want? He finally said. The desperation had burned off, leaving something flat and stripped down. The voice of a man asking a question he already knows costs him everything. I want what I've always deserved, she said. Credit for my work, compensation for my intellectual property, and a divorce from a man who valued my brilliance only when he could claim it as his own. She hung up, blocked his number, turned off her phone. In the morning there would be Margaret's office and legal filings and the full machinery of consequence set into motion. There would be scrutiny and challenge and the long, grinding work of translating 5 years of invisible labor into a public legal record. There would be harder days than this one. But for now, in this quiet room, Meline Carter stood in front of a mirror in her undergarments, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her wine-dark lipstick still precise, and she looked at the woman she had finally decided to become. She recognized her. That was, she thought, a beginning. The morning arrived with the particular brutality of mornings that have not waited to be invited. At 6:47 a.m., before Meline had finished her first cup of coffee, someone was pounding on the door of her hotel room. She looked through the peephole and saw hotel security removing a journalist from the hallway, a woman who was still shouting questions even as she was escorted firmly toward the elevator. Meline called the front desk. The manager answered with professional distress and the cadence of a man who understood that his establishment had found itself adjacent to a news event. Miss Carter, I'm so sorry. We're moving you to a more secure floor immediately. We have no idea how they located you. I can only assure you. It's all right, Meline said. I'll be ready to move in 20 minutes. The executive floor required a key card to access. Security stationed in the hallway. The manager delivered breakfast personally, along with apologies that felt genuine, which she appreciated. Over coffee, she finally turned her phone on. The avalanche was immediate. She had 214 text messages, 47 missed calls, an inbox that had exceeded its comfortable capacity and was now simply accumulating in a state of overwhelming abundance. She scrolled through them with the methodical attention of someone conducting inventory sorting mentally as she went. Former colleagues from Patterson and Rhodes, a dozen messages ranging from shock to warmth to the particular cautious support of people who are genuinely sympathetic but uncertain about the professional implications of expressing it too loudly. She made a mental note to respond to each of them personally eventually. Journalists, she stopped counting at 30. Major publications, trade press, morning news programs, at least 2 documentary producers who had apparently identified an opportunity within 12 hours of the gala's conclusion. She would speak with none of them before speaking with Margaret. Investors, some she recognized from years of company events, some she had met at the gala, some who had clearly found her contact information through channels she preferred not to examine too closely. The messages ranged from sympathy to calculation to something in between, the particular tone of people who are managing their own exposure while trying to assess hers. And then buried near the middle, a message from a name she had not expected, David Morrison, Caldwell Global Board of Directors. She read it twice. Miss Carter, I've just become fully informed about the scope of your contributions to Caldwell Global's strategic development. I want to express my profound regret that I participated, however unknowingly, in the erasure of your work. Several board members share this concern. If you are willing to speak with us, we would appreciate the opportunity to discuss how the board intends to address this situation. We take intellectual property violations with the utmost seriousness. Meline set the phone down on the breakfast table and looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up and forwarded the message to Margaret with a single line. Thoughts. The response came back in 4 minutes. Don't respond yet. Let me reach out officially. Get to my office as soon as you can move safely. Margaret Chen's office occupied the 31st floor of a building that had been designed to communicate permanence and precision, all clean lines and carefully controlled light, the aesthetic of a firm that had never once needed to shout. Margaret herself was waiting in the conference room, surrounded by organized stacks of documents and the focused energy of a woman who had not slept much and had made productive use of the insomnia. First things first, Margaret said, gesturing Meline to the chair across from her. How are you holding up? I'm functioning, Meline said, which was true and was also about as much as she could honestly claim. Margaret nodded with the brisk practicality of a woman who appreciated honest assessment. That's appropriate. What you did last night required extraordinary courage, and the adrenaline crash is both real and temporary. What is not temporary is the legal and strategic position you've created, which is... She paused, and the ghost of a smile crossed her face. Remarkable. She poured them both water from a carafe and pulled her legal pad to the center of the table. We're filing 2 actions simultaneously today. First, divorce proceedings with comprehensive claims on marital assets, including your intellectual property contributions. Second, a formal intellectual property claim against Caldwell Global itself, seeking recognition and compensation for the strategic frameworks you developed. Both at once, Meline said. Both at once, Margaret confirmed. The divorce establishes your right to marital assets. The IP claim establishes your professional contributions as independent of the marriage. Together, they create a case for ownership of the company's most significant value-generating assets. She slid a thick folder across the table. I've drafted preliminary filings based on the documentation you provided. I need you to review everything and tell me if anything is inaccurate or incomplete. Meline spent the next hour and 15 minutes reading through legal language that translated the lived experience of 5 years into formal claims and arguments. Seeing her work cataloged this way, each strategy memo, each market analysis, each framework she had built from nothing was a strange doubling experience. She was simultaneously the person who had produced these things in quiet and the person reading the official record of them as though they belonged to someone she was representing. In a sense, they did. This is thorough, she said, returning the folder. It needs to be, Margaret said. Ethan's legal team is already working. I've heard from 2 different sources that he's brought in outside litigation counsel, not his usual firm. More aggressive. What's their likely strategy? Claim the contributions were collaborative and impossible to individually attribute. Suggest your motivation is financial, a woman who wants to claim her husband's success in a divorce proceeding and is constructing a narrative to justify it. Margaret's voice was clinical. They may also question your mental state. The scorned wife making wild accusations from a place of emotional instability. Meline was quiet for a moment. Of course they will. Which is why the evidence has to be so comprehensive that it becomes structurally impossible to dismiss, Margaret said. Your documentation is extraordinarily strong, but I want to add one more element. She passed Meline a printed email exchange. David Morrison, he responded to my initial outreach this morning. The full board wants to meet with you Monday. They're conducting an internal investigation, and they've indicated their preliminary review of your documentation has raised serious concerns. Serious concerns, Meline said. That's careful language. Morrison's personal message to me was less careful, Margaret said dryly. He used the word appalled 3 times. Meline thought about the board meetings she had heard described secondhand, the rooms she had never been invited into, the presentations where Ethan had walked in with her frameworks and walked out with his reputation. How many of them knew I was involved? Based on Morrison's account, none of them. Ethan presented everything through the lens of executive leadership and team development. No individual contributions were ever named. Margaret paused. Which, from an evidentiary standpoint, is actually useful. It establishes that the erasure was not incidental or accidental. It was systematic. There was a knock at the conference room door. Margaret's assistant leaned in. The coverage is escalating. CNN is running an extended segment about invisible labor in corporate America, using Ms. Carter's case as the primary example. And there's a Twitter hashtag, #HiddenArchitects, that's trending nationally. Meline looked at the assistant. What kind of hashtag? The assistant turned her tablet around. The feed that filled the screen was dense and moving hundreds of posts per minute, each one a variation on the same essential story. Spent 3 years developing the algorithm that made our product successful. My manager presented it as his breakthrough at the company All Hands. Seeing Meline Carter speak gives me something I haven't had in a long time. #HiddenArchitects. I wrote every proposal that landed our biggest clients. My name appears exactly nowhere in the company's official history. #HiddenArchitects. My wife developed the pricing model that saved our startup. I took credit in investor meetings for 8 years before she finally told me what it had cost her. I am the Ethan Caldwell in my marriage. I am trying to be better. #HiddenArchitects. The way she walked out of that ballroom, the way she said her name. I've watched it 6 times. #HiddenArchitects. Meline sat very still looking at the screen. Margaret spoke quietly. You've started something. I've started something, Meline said. Not a question. Just the recognition of a fact that was still arriving, still finding its full shape. These women are looking to you, Margaret said. I know. Meline set the tablet down. She felt the weight of that not as a burden exactly, but as a kind of gravity, something real that pulled in a specific direction. What does that mean for the case? It means the public dimension of this is going to be significant and sustained. It also means Ethan's team is going to have a very difficult time painting you as a scorned, unreliable woman in the face of a national conversation about the exact phenomenon you're describing. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. The timing is not unfortunate. They filed the paperwork at 9 a.m. Monday morning, exactly as planned. Meline stood at the courthouse counter and signed her name to the documents that would formally end her marriage and initiate legal action against the company she had built. The clerk processed everything with practiced indifference, and Meline found something almost comforting in that the bureaucratic ordinariness of it, the fact that what she was doing fit into existing categories, had established procedures, was comprehensible to the institutional machinery of the world. By 9:30, the documents had been served. By 10 o'clock, every major business publication had the story. By noon, the Caldwell Global board meeting had been formally convened. Walking into the Caldwell Global headquarters felt like entering a building she had built but never been allowed to name. The lobby was 12 floors below the executive conference room where the board waited. Glass and steel financed in significant part by the success of her European expansion strategy. She had visited these offices over the years to drop off documents to meet Ethan for lunch, always as Mrs. Caldwell, always as an appendage of the man whose name was on the building directory. The security guard looked at her with undisguised confusion when she stated her name. Mrs. Caldwell, I thought the news. I have a board meeting, she said. They're expecting me. Margaret walked beside her to the elevator. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to rehearse. Look, the conference room on the executive floor was already full when they arrived. David Morrison sat at the head of the table, a compact man in his early 60s with the specific gravity of someone who has spent decades making significant decisions and carries their cumulative weight in his posture. To his left and right were the other board members, faces Meline recognized from years of company events where she had been present as decoration. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, his lawyer beside him looking like a man who has not slept in 3 days and is conducting himself on the structural support of obligation alone. He met her eyes when she entered. She met his and then looked at Morrison. "Thank you all for coming," Morrison began. His tone was formal and grave in the particular way of someone for whom gravity is not a performance. "Ms. Carter, your attorney has provided the board with extensive documentation. We'd like to hear your account directly." Meline stood. She had done this before. She had stood in rooms and made cases and moved the understanding of powerful people from one position to another through the careful accumulation of evidence and argument. She had been good at it. She had been, by most measures, exceptional at it. She activated the presentation Margaret had prepared and began. "For the past 5 years," she said, "I have developed the strategic frameworks that transformed Caldwell Global from a regional importer into an international presence. I authored every major market analysis, every expansion model, every partnership strategy that drove the company's growth. And I did it without credit, without acknowledgement, without compensation beyond the indirect benefits of being married to the CEO." She moved through the slides with deliberate precision. The Jakarta contract framework, 4 days of research implemented exactly as written. The German market entry strategy, 18 months of regulatory mapping presented to this board as executive vision. The French distribution model, the Warsaw Partnership Framework, the Eastern European logistics analysis, one after another, a record of invisible labor made suddenly irrefutably visible. The board members watched in silence. Morrison's expression traveled from formal gravity through troubled attention to something that looked by the 15th slide like genuine anger. "The pattern is consistent across every major initiative," Meline said. "I developed the strategy. Mr. Caldwell presented it as his own. The company benefited while I remained completely invisible." She paused. "This is not collaboration where attribution got lost in the shuffle. This is systematic erasure." One of the board members, Gerald Winters, the venture capitalist who had invested heavily in the European expansion, leaned forward. "Mr. Caldwell, these are serious allegations. How do you respond?" Ethan's lawyer started to speak. Ethan waved him off. He stood slowly facing Meline across the length of the table, and his voice when he spoke was tight, but not entirely without dignity. "Everything Meline is saying is technically accurate," he said. "She did contribute to the strategies we implemented. Her analytical work was significant, but to characterize her as the sole architect—" "Show me one strategy document with your name on it," Meline interrupted. "One analysis you authored independently. One framework you developed without my research as its foundation." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Collaborative work doesn't function that way." "It functions exactly that way when you want to claim exclusive credit," she said. "When I asked you to acknowledge my contributions publicly, you told me it would complicate the narrative. When I suggested my name should appear on strategic documents, you said it was unnecessary because we were a team. But when it came time to present those strategies to investors, suddenly they were your proprietary vision." She pulled up the final section of the presentation, the emails from Ethan's private account that she had compiled in the early hours of that November morning. The messages where he had discussed keeping her contributions invisible. The explicit plan to ensure she could not claim ownership when the marriage ended. The board members read in silence. Morrison's expression when he looked up had moved past anger into something colder and more settled. "Is this accurate, Ethan?" Ethan's lawyer put a hand on his client's arm. Ethan sat. The silence that followed was the answer. "I'd like the board to recess," Morrison said finally. "An hour. We need to deliberate." Meline and Margaret waited in a smaller conference room down the hall with windows that looked out over the city, all those lives proceeding in ordinary parallel, entirely unaware of what was being decided 31 floors above them. "You did everything right," Margaret said. "We'll see." Meline said. They sat with the window and the city and the long hour of waiting, and Meline thought about what she was asking the board to do. Not just to believe her, the evidence made belief practically mandatory, but to act on that belief. To take a position that would have significant consequences for the company, for its investors, for the institutional relationships that the board had spent years cultivating. To acknowledge formally and on the record that they had been complicit, however unknowingly, in something that should not have been allowed to continue. That was harder than belief. That required something closer to courage. She thought about Morrison's message from the morning, appalled. 3 times. Maybe courage wasn't entirely out of reach. An hour and 12 minutes later, Morrison summoned them back. The board members had the specific quality of people who have made a difficult decision and are now committed to it. Morrison spoke with measured precision, choosing each word with care. Ms. Carter, the board has reviewed your evidence comprehensively and finds your claims both credible and deeply concerning. He paused. Effective immediately, Mr. Caldwell is suspended from his duties as CEO, pending a full independent investigation into intellectual property practices at Caldwell Global. We are retaining an outside firm to conduct a comprehensive audit of strategic development attribution across the full period of your contribution. Meline's breath stilled. Additionally, Morrison continued, the board would like to offer you a formal consulting engagement with full attribution for any strategic work you have developed or will develop. We recognize that your expertise has been central to this company's success, and we want to ensure you are properly credited and compensated going forward. A second board member spoke. The board is also prepared to discuss settlement of your intellectual property claims. Our preliminary assessment suggests that significant value has been generated through your work, and we believe you are entitled to substantial compensation for that contribution. Margaret glanced at Meline with the contained energy of someone who has just watched her case exceed its own projections. Meline said carefully, I appreciate the board's willingness to address these allegations seriously. I'll need to discuss the specifics with my attorney. But I want to be clear about one thing. She looked at Morrison directly. This is not about the money. It's about the record. Whatever settlement is reached, I need it to be accurate. No soft language. No suggestion that this was collaborative confusion. The record has to say what actually happened. We understand, Morrison said, and we agree. As they left the building, stepping out into the afternoon light, Margaret exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. That, she said quietly, is how justice begins. Meline looked back at the glass tower, at the 30 stories of steel and ambition financed by strategies she had developed in a converted guest room, and felt something release in her chest. A tension so old she had stopped recognizing it as tension. Something she had been holding since the day she had first understood that the partnership she had believed in was a story only she had been told. It's not over, she said. No, Margaret agreed. But it's begun. The city moved around them, indifferent and constant. But Meline Carter walked through it differently than she had walked through it the day before. She walked through it like someone who had said her name and survived the saying of it, and the echo of it was still traveling. The coverage that week was a landscape she had never navigated before. She had been in the news once briefly at the beginning of her career, a small profile in a regional legal publication about promising young associates at major firms. She had read it 3 times and felt proud in the modest way of someone who has been noticed for something they genuinely worked for. This was not that. By Tuesday morning, her case had migrated from business journalism into the broader cultural conversation. Morning news programs debated the legal implications. Opinion writers analyzed the systemic dimensions. Social scientists were quoted about the phenomenon of invisible labor in professional partnerships. A professor at a business school in Boston had already begun incorporating her case into her curriculum, citing it as a near-perfect example of intellectual property misattribution in marital and professional contexts. And the hashtag Hidden Architects conversation kept expanding day by day with an accumulative momentum that began to feel like something structural rather than something trending. Women from every industry continued sharing their own versions of the same essential story. Each new testimonial seemed to pull 5 more from the digital silence where they had been waiting. Meline read them every morning with the focused attention of someone taking inventory, and she felt in the specific weight of each one the dimensions of what she had apparently unlocked. It was enormous. It was at moments frightening. Not all the coverage was sympathetic. Conservative commentators argued that she was attempting to claim credit for her husband's success in order to extract a disproportionate divorce settlement. Several business publications ran opinion pieces questioning whether her contributions had truly been as foundational as she claimed, citing unnamed industry sources who had observed Ethan Caldwell in meetings and found him to be genuinely strategic. Online, the hostility was at times vicious, personal, targeted, designed to find the specific kind of wound that destabilizes a person's confidence in what they know to be true. Meline read it all. She believed with the conviction of a litigator that understanding your opposition required looking at it directly. So she looked at it and she noted it, and then she went back to working with Margaret's team to construct a legal case so comprehensive that the hostile reading of her story would require the jury to disregard not just her testimony, but approximately 2,400 pages of time-stamped documentation. She was not worried about the documentation. Ethan's messages had continued in the days after the gala, despite her explicit request that all communication go through lawyers. She read them in order, tracking the emotional arc they traced from anger through pleading through the strange quiet of a man who has begun to process the scale of what he has lost. She did not respond to any of them, but she kept them, forwarding each one to Margaret with the note for the record. The lawyers predictably argued. Ethan's legal team, the more aggressive outside firm he had retained, mounted the exact defense Margaret had predicted: collaborative attribution, impossible to individually assign a woman whose grief about an affair was distorting her memory of her professional contributions. They were skilled, they were expensive, and they had the significant advantage of representing the party with greater institutional resources. They did not have the documentation. The first deposition was set for 3 weeks after the filing. Meline prepared for it with Margaret for 6 days. 6 long sessions of going through the evidence piece by piece, rehearsing testimony, anticipating every line of attack the opposing counsel would deploy. It was exhausting, and it was necessary, and it was in its own way a return to the professional self she had set aside when she left the firm. She had been good at this. She had forgotten in the long gray years of invisible work how good she had been at this. 2 weeks after the gala, Meline's assistant buzzed the conference room at Margaret's office, where Meline had effectively taken up residence. "There's a Chloe Bennett in the lobby," the assistant said carefully. "She says it's urgent." Meline looked at Margaret, who raised her eyebrows with the expression of a woman who is going to let her client make this call. She thought about the woman who had stood at the edge of the stage with her hand over her mouth, watching her own story collapse in real time. She thought about what it had taken for Chloe to show up here uninvited, knowing that the woman she was asking to see had every reason to refuse. "Send her up," Meline said. "And yes, record it." Chloe Bennett did not look like the polished executive assistant who had appeared at the gala. She looked like a woman who had been through something difficult and had stopped trying to look like she hadn't. Her hair was pulled back simply. Her face was clear of makeup. Her eyes were red at the edges in the way of someone who has been crying recently, and with some regularity. She stood in the conference room doorway until Meline gestured to a chair. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," Chloe said. She sat with her hands clasped in her lap, the posture of someone bracing for impact. "You're probably not wrong about that," Meline said. "So why are you here?" Chloe took a breath. "Because I owe you an apology, and because there's information you should have." She looked up. "He told me you'd been separated for over a year. He said the marriage was over and everything except the paperwork. He said you'd both agreed to keep up appearances for business reasons, that you each understood the arrangement and had moved on privately." "And you believed him?" "I believed him," Chloe said. The words were flat and self-judging. "I believed him because I wanted to, because he was convincing and successful, and he made me feel—" She stopped, started again. "He made me feel like I was seeing something special, like I was the person who understood him in a way his wife didn't, like what we had was different from the thing he was presenting to the world." "It's a very old story," Meline said. "I know that now." Chloe's hands tightened in her lap. "After the gala, he called me furious. He said I had pressured him into bringing me, that my demands had forced him into an impossible position, That if I hadn't been so insistent, you never would have found out about us. She paused. He said I'd ruined everything. Me. I had ruined everything. Meline listened without speaking. I quit the next morning, Chloe said. I went to his office and I told him I was done. That's when he showed me who he really was. She reached into her bag and produced a folder, setting it on the conference table between them. He had his lawyers prepare a severance package. In exchange for my signature on an NDA, never discuss our relationship, never speak about anything I had seen or heard at the company. But you didn't sign it, Meline said. I didn't sign it, Chloe confirmed. Because while I was reading through the settlement documents, I saw other things. Emails, meeting notes, messages where he discussed your work with other executives, where he explicitly outlined his strategy for keeping your contributions invisible, and where he talked about protecting himself from potential ownership claims when the marriage ended. She met Meline's eyes for the first time. Mrs. Carter, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for believing his lies. I'm sorry for not asking harder questions. I'm sorry for being one of the instruments of something I didn't understand I was part of. Meline sat with that for a long moment. It's Carter, she said at last, quietly. I'm going back to my maiden name. Something in Chloe's expression shifted, not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. For what it's worth, Suez, she said, I hope you take everything. After Chloe left, Margaret picked up the folder with both hands and began reading with the focused attention of a woman who can assess the value of a document in under 2 minutes. Her expression as she read went through several evolutions. When she set it down, she looked at Meline with something that was almost awe. This establishes intent, she said. Not just carelessness, not just the kind of collaborative ambiguity his lawyers are going to argue. These emails show deliberate, systematic suppression of your contributions with the explicit goal of protecting his position in the event of a divorce. She paused. This is fraud, Meline. It changes the entire character of the case. Meline looked at the folder on the table. She thought about the girl who had walked in here carrying it. The girl who had loved a man who had used her the same way he had used his wife, just on a shorter timeline, with fewer years to obscure the mechanism. She thought about what it had cost Chloe to come here. The particular courage it takes to apologize to someone you've wronged when you're not sure they'll receive it. She loved him, Meline said quietly. She loved him, Margaret agreed. And he threw her away the moment she became inconvenient. Exactly, Margaret said, as he planned to do with you. The two women sat with that truth for a moment in the clean, efficient light of the conference room. Then Meline straightened in her chair. What does this do to the timeline? She asked. Margaret's eyes gleamed. It accelerates everything. The weeks leading up to the trial date unfolded with the compressed intensity of a season that has too much weather in too short a time. Depositions, expert witnesses, forensic accounting of the company's financial trajectory against the timeline of her strategic contributions. Margaret's team worked with the focused precision of people who understood they were assembling something that had to be structurally perfect because Ethan's team was going to test every joint and every seam. Meline spent hours in deposition prep that felt at times like being cross-examined about her own biography. When had she developed the German market entry framework? Walk us through the research process. Who else was involved? Can you identify anyone else who contributed to this analysis? No one, she said. I did it alone. I always did it alone. She said it without apology, without defensiveness, with the plain certainty of someone stating a documented fact. The opposing counsel's experts argued that the strategies were obvious applications of standard methodology. Nothing proprietary. Nothing innovative. Nothing that couldn't have been developed by any competent business strategist with access to the right data. Margaret's experts disagreed specifically and at length with the kind of technical precision that required the opposing counsel to ask for frequent recesses. Through it all, Meline worked. Carter's Strategic Consulting had 3 clients now: Harrison Chen's tech company, a manufacturing firm that had found her through the Gala coverage, and a private equity group that wanted her perspective on a portfolio of European logistics assets. She worked on their projects in the hours between legal sessions and depositions, building the frameworks that would carry her name, delivering analyses under her own byline, collecting the evidence of what her professional life looked like when it was allowed to be visible. She was building the future at the same time she was litigating the past, and the parallel construction of it was, she found to her genuine surprise, not exhausting. It was sustaining. Victor called every few days. Not about business, just to check in, which she found she appreciated in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had spent so long in a marriage where being checked on was a performance of concern that she had forgotten it could simply be what it appeared to be. "How are you sleeping?" he asked one afternoon. "Better than I was," she said. "Worse than I will be." "That sounds like progress." "That's what I'm choosing to call it." 2 weeks before the scheduled trial date, Ethan's legal team requested a settlement conference. Margaret's expression when she delivered the news was the controlled satisfaction of a woman who has been expecting this moment and is glad it has arrived on schedule. "They're out of runway," she said. "The evidence is too comprehensive. They can't win at trial." "How much?" Meline asked. "They're opening with 70% of the company's current valuation, plus a public statement acknowledging your contributions." Meline considered the offer for exactly the time it deserved. "No." Margaret waited. "I want 85%, Meline said, "based on my intellectual property contributions during the company's growth phase. I want full ownership of all strategic frameworks I developed, not just recognition, actual legal ownership. And I want the public statement drafted by my attorney, not his. No soft language. No collaborative framing. The statement says what happened. And if he won't agree to 85, then I'll see him in court," Meline said, "and I'll win." Margaret allowed herself a full smile. "I'll set up the meeting." The settlement conference was held in a neutral location, a conference room in a building that belonged to neither party, chosen specifically for its absence of significance. Meline arrived with Margaret at precisely the scheduled time. Ethan arrived with his lawyer 3 minutes later, looking like a man who has slept poorly for a month and has made a kind of peace with it. He tried to catch her eye when he sat down across the table. She let him. She looked at him fully without the careful peripheral management she had been practicing since the night she had found the text message. She looked at him the way you look at something you have finally decided you understand. The negotiation that followed lasted 4 hours. Numbers moved, language was argued. At 3 p.m., Ethan's lawyer called a recess and emerged 20 minutes later with a revised offer, 83%. Margaret looked at Meline. Meline looked at her lawyer and said nothing. At 4:30 p.m., Ethan's lawyer offered 85. At 4:47 p.m., Meline signed a term sheet that gave her 85% of the company's peak valuation, full ownership of all strategic intellectual property she had developed, and the right to approve the language of every public statement. Ethan signed 12 minutes later, sitting at the end of the table with his pen hand slightly unsteady and his face arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who is maintaining dignity by an act of considerable will. The lawyers shook hands. The conference room began to clear. Ethan and Meline were left briefly alone by the particular inefficiency of people gathering their things and moving at slightly different speeds. He looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. She considered the words, their weight, what they cost him to say and what they failed to repair. "I know," she said. Then she gathered her bag and walked out into the corridor where Margaret was waiting with the quiet energy of a woman who has just won a significant battle and is already thinking about what comes next. "It's done," Meline said. "The beginning of it." Margaret agreed. Meline nodded. She thought about the closing documents that would be finalized in the morning. The formal dissolution, the legal transfer of ownership, the end of one chapter written in her name at last. "Let's go," she said. "We have work to do." That night, alone in the apartment she had moved into after leaving the hotel, she had declined to return to the house, had sent movers for her professional files and her grandmother's jewelry and a few other things that were entirely hers. Meline sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking and the closing documents spread in front of her. She read through them slowly. Not for information she knew what they said, but for the particular satisfaction of seeing certain things in writing. Her name on the ownership stake, her intellectual property listed by title and description, the formal legal acknowledgement that the Jakarta contract framework and the German market entry strategy and the French distribution model, and the 23 other strategic documents catalogued in the appendix had been created by Meline Carter. She read it the way you read something you have waited a long time to be true. When she finished, she set the documents aside and picked up her phone and looked at the hashtag Hidden Architects feed for the first time in several days. The conversation had not diminished. If anything, it had deepened, moving past the initial outpouring of individual stories into something that felt more structural. Women organizing, networks forming, conversations between employment lawyers and their clients taking a different shape because a client had walked in and cited a case they'd seen in the news and asked, "Can this be done? Can I do this?" She read until midnight, then she put her phone down and sat in the quiet of her apartment. Her furniture, her silence. That belonged to her, and thought about the woman she intended to become now that the woman she had been was fully accounted for. She did not yet know all the shapes of it, but she knew its direction. She knew the work she was going to do and the people she was going to help do it. She knew that the settlement was not an ending. It was the first day she had enough resources and enough visibility and enough freedom to begin building something that was entirely irrevocably publicly hers. She had been the hidden architect for 5 years. She was done hiding. The settlement was finalized on a Wednesday morning in early May. The conference room where they signed was the same one they had used for the term sheet neutral professionally appointed, designed to suggest that what happened inside it was simply business. The lawyers moved through the process with practiced efficiency. Documents placed, reviewed, signed, witnessed, collected. The mechanical transfer of ownership from the fiction of collaborative marriage to the legal reality of individual intellectual property. Ethan's hand trembled slightly when he signed the final page. Meline's did not. When it was done, she gathered her bag and coat with the organized calm of someone who has arrived at the end of something long and is already thinking about what begins next. "What happens to the company now?" Ethan said. His voice had the quality of a room after a storm emptied out with a strange calm in it. Meline looked at him across the length of the table. "That's no longer your concern," she said. "As of this morning, you have no ownership stake and no decision-making authority. You're going to shut it down," he said. "Sell it off." She tilted her head. "Is that what you think this is, destruction for its own sake?" He didn't answer. He looked like a man who had stopped being sure what he thought anything was. "I didn't demolish what you built," she said. "I reclaimed what I built that you had claimed as yours." She paused. "There's a difference. You should start learning to understand it." She left him there. Outside, the May morning was warm and clear spring, having finally arrived with the conviction of something that has waited long enough. Margaret walked beside her toward the car. "How does it feel?" Margaret asked. Meline considered the question as seriously as it deserved. "Incomplete," she said. "The legal victory is necessary, but the real work hasn't started yet." Carter's strategic consulting was 3 months old by the time the settlement closed and already growing at a pace that required attention. Meline didn't always have available. She had 4 clients now. Harrison Chen's European expansion, a mid-size pharmaceutical distributor navigating EU regulatory changes, a private equity firm evaluating logistics assets in Poland, and a French retail group that had found her through the International Trade Council's post-Gala coverage and wanted her perspective on their North American entry. She worked from the apartment, which was temporary, and from Margaret's conference room, which was increasingly inadequate, and from coffee shops and hotel lobbies when both were occupied. She had hired one analyst, a woman named Priya, who had left a major consulting firm after watching her client research methodology, credited to a senior partner in 3 consecutive presentations, and was in conversations with 2 others. She was building something. It was not yet large enough to be called a company in the full sense, but it had the bones of one. More importantly, it had a reputation. The visibility that had come from the Gala and the legal case and the national conversation about invisible labor had accomplished something that years of uncredited work could never have. It had made her name recognizable before she walked into a room. Clients sought her. They came with knowledge of who she was, which was an entirely new experience. It was also she was discovering a responsibility. The first time a client had said to her, "We want to work with you specifically because of what you did at the Gala," a CEO of a mid-size import company, who had watched the live stream from Singapore, Meline had felt a complex mixture of gratitude and something more unsettling. A recognition that the story she had told had become something people used to locate themselves in relation to their own experience. That made it matter in a way that extended well beyond her personal reclamation. She was thinking about what to do with that when Victor called. They met at the private club again, the room that had begun for both of them to carry the weight of significant conversations. Victor was already seated when she arrived, a cup of coffee in front of him, and the particular stillness of a man with something specific to say. He let her settle order take the first sip. "I want to buy Caldwell Global," he said. Meline set her cup down slowly. "What's left of it anyway?" Victor continued. He folded his hands on the table. "The client relationships, the operational infrastructure, the European contract portfolio that happens to be built on strategies I know firsthand are exceptional. The company has lost considerable value since the scandal. The stock is down 40% from peak. Several major investors have pulled out, but the underlying assets are still real. With proper leadership and a clear strategic direction, it could be rebuilt into something sustainable." You don't need my involvement to buy those assets," Meline said carefully. "I don't want the assets," Victor said. "I want to build something with them, something different from what they were, and I can't do that without you." He paused. "Not as a silent partner, not as an invisible strategist, as co-CEO with full public acknowledgement of your role and your authority." Meline was quiet for a long moment. She had assumed she would liquidate whatever remained of Caldwell Global, dissolve it, distribute the settlement proceeds, and let the name disappear from the industry landscape, as names built on theft eventually must. She had not imagined wanting anything to do with it after the settlement. "Why?" she said. "Because I think there's a story worth telling," Victor said. "Right now, your narrative is about reclamation, about taking back what was stolen. That's an important story, but imagine if it became something more, if it became a story about what you build afterward, about taking something that was constructed on theft and corruption and transforming it publicly into a model of what ethical business actually looks like in practice." He pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it between them. "I'm not asking you to rehabilitate Ethan Caldwell's legacy. I'm asking you to replace it with your own." Meline looked at the folder without opening it. She thought about the operational infrastructure she knew well. The European client relationships she had cultivated through proxy for 5 years, the logistics networks built on her frameworks, the partnerships she had designed and Ethan had formalized. She knew every part of it. She had built every part of it. She had also learned in the past 3 months that she was capable of building things on her own terms. The question was whether this was an extension of that capability or a retreat into a story she was supposed to be leaving behind. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. "I'm grateful for everything you've done, but you didn't need to do any of it. Why invest this heavily in my success?" Victor was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he looked at the table first, then at her, as though he had decided something about how much to give. 20 years ago, he said, my mother was pushed out of a company she had helped build. She was brilliant, a genuine strategic mind. She had also made the mistake of going into business with her husband, and when their marriage ended, she walked away with almost nothing." He paused. He used her frameworks, her contacts, her analytical work to build something significant. She spent the rest of her life watching it happen and never finding a way to say what had actually occurred. She died 2 years ago, and her name doesn't appear anywhere in that company's official history. Meline was silent. "I couldn't help her," Victor said. "But maybe I can help you. And maybe in the process we can demonstrate that there is a different way to do business. That transparency isn't just ethically superior, it's economically superior. That companies built on proper attribution of intellectual work are stronger, not weaker than companies built on theft." He slid the folder closer. "That's worth building." Meline picked up the folder. She read through Victor's proposal with the focused attention she brought to all important documents, no skimming, no conclusion jumping, just the linear, patient accumulation of understanding. The financial terms were generous, but structured carefully, protecting both parties. The operational structure gave her complete authority over strategic direction. Victor retained board representation and financial management, The arrangement was genuinely equal in the ways that actually mattered. She set it down after 20 minutes. If we do this, she said, we rename the company. Victor nodded as though he had been expecting this. What do you want to call it? Carter Alvarez International, she said. Equal partnership, equal acknowledgement, complete transparency about who built what and who is building what. Victor extended his hand across the table. I like it. She shook it. When can you start? He said. She thought about the clients she was already serving, the analyst she had hired, the plans she had been developing. All of it was real and valuable. All of it would continue, but none of it was the scale of what Victor was proposing. I need 2 weeks to restructure my existing commitments, she said. After that, we start immediately. The announcement of Carter Alvarez International hit the business press with the force of a story that had been waiting for its second act. Industry commentators who had followed the Gala revelation and its legal aftermath saw it clearly. The woman who had reclaimed her name was now claiming something larger. She was not simply taking what had been stolen. She was building something new out of what had been left. The reaction was complex and substantive. Some observers were skeptical, suggesting that Meline was making a strategic error by anchoring her professional identity to the company associated with her most traumatic professional experience. Others argued that the rebranding was audacious precisely because it acknowledged the messy origin story rather than concealing it, making it structurally impossible for anyone to pretend that Carter Alvarez International had arrived from nowhere. The response from the hashtag Hidden Architects community was immediate and intense. Women who had been following Meline's story through every phase of it responded to the announcement with a specific kind of recognition, not just of her individual success, but of what it implied about possibility. If she could do this, not just survive the exposure, but build something from it, then the architecture of what came next looked different than it had. Meline read the responses carefully. She had been thinking about the Carter Initiative, the foundation concept she had sketched out months ago, and the announcement of Carter Alvarez International clarified something for her. The initiative was not separate from the company. It was its moral foundation. The public articulation of what Carter Alvarez International stood for was inseparable from the commitment to helping others reclaim their own invisible work. She called Margaret on a Tuesday evening in late May from the corner of the apartment that had become her temporary office. I want to formally establish the Carter Initiative, she said, as a standalone foundation with its own governance structure and dedicated funding, not just a program I run alongside the company, an actual institution. You have resources from the settlement, Margaret said, and the profile, and the relationships. A pause. What you need is a board and a clear institutional mission. I know what the mission is, Meline said. I've known it since I read the first 100 messages on the hashtag Hidden Architects feed. Legal support for intellectual property claims. Career counseling for women rebuilding after years of invisible professional contribution. Networking access that doesn't require being someone's wife or assistant to enter the room. She paused. And grant funding for litigation, so that women who can't afford to fight can fight anyway. That last one is significant, Margaret said carefully. Litigation funding for IP cases in collaborative work environments that's largely unprecedented at the foundation level. I know, Meline said. That's why it matters. Margaret was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the quality it got when she had made a decision. I'll take a board seat, she said, pro bono. I was going to ask, Meline said. I know you were, Margaret said. That's why I said it first. The first board meeting of Carter Alvarez International was held in early July in a conference room that had been completely redesigned from its Caldwell Global configuration. New layout, new furniture, new light. The physical grammar of the space made deliberately unfamiliar, so that no one walking in would feel they were continuing something that had previously occurred here. Meline stood at the head of the table for the first time in her professional life and looked at the faces around it. She recognized some of them from years of company events. Board members who had chosen to remain through the transition, whose preliminary engagement with her evidence had moved them from Ethan's silent supporters to something more like genuine partners. She recognized Victor at the opposite end of the table, his expression composed and watchful, with the specific attention of someone who is watching a long-held belief confirmed in real time. And she recognized the others, new members, people she had recruited specifically because they shared the values she intended Carter Alvarez International to institutionalize. She had prepared remarks. She had revised them 3 times. But when she stood at the head of the table and looked at the room, she set the notes aside. Before we discuss operations, she said, I want to talk about what we're actually building here and why. The room gave her its full attention. Carter Alvarez International exists because I developed strategies that built a company I was never allowed to name myself as having built. That's the origin story. It's not comfortable, and I don't intend to hide it or soften it. She looked around the table. Every major company has an origin story. Ours is the one where the person who should have been the CEO spent 5 years as an invisible strategist and then decided that invisibility was no longer a condition she was willing to accept. She let that settle for a moment. What that means for how we operate is this transparent attribution. Every strategy, every framework, every analysis that comes from this company will be clearly credited to its actual author. Junior analysts, senior executives, external consultants, everyone's contributions will be documented and acknowledged and compensated proportionally to their contribution. No exceptions. Klaus Verer, who had joined the board at Victor's recommendation, leaned forward. That will require significant operational infrastructure. Proper attribution at every level of a complex organization is not a trivial undertaking. I know, Meline said. That's why we're building the infrastructure before we need it, rather than after it becomes a crisis. Attribution is not a nice to have, it's a structural principle. If we get it right, we'll attract better talent, maintain better partnerships, and avoid the kind of institutional fragility that comes from building a company on borrowed credit. She moved to the next point on her outline, which she now held in her head rather than on paper. Equitable partnership. We're going to actively recruit and promote people who have been excluded from leadership positions, not as a PR exercise, but because the kind of diversity that actually strengthens organizations is the kind that comes from genuinely different professional experiences and ways of seeing problems. We're leaving significant talent on the table as an industry by keeping certain people invisible. We're going to stop doing that. The board meeting ran for 3 hours. By the end of it, Meline had unanimous commitment to the direction she had articulated and the specific operational framework she had proposed for achieving it. As the room cleared, Victor lingered. That was exceptional, he said quietly. Words are easy, she said. Following through is the work. You'll follow through, he said. I know it. She looked at him for a moment. How are you so sure? He smiled a real smile, the kind that had nothing behind it except what it appeared to be. Because I've read your strategy memos, he said. Every one of them. I know how you work. The months that followed were the most demanding and the most sustaining of Meline's professional life. Building Carter Alvarez International. From the ground up, not inheriting a company, but genuinely reconstructing one with new values and new systems, and the very specific challenge of making institutional principles into operational reality required more of her than anything she had done before. Not more intelligence, more presence, more willingness to be the person in the room who was responsible for what happened in it. She had spent 5 years operating as the mind behind someone else's presence. Learning to occupy her own presence fully and without apology was the work she had not anticipated needing to do. Some days it came easily in client meetings where she could see the work clearly, in strategic sessions where her analytical depth set the direction for everyone else in the room, in the moments when she looked at a framework she had built and knew without question that it was good. Other days it arrived with the peculiar friction of something genuine and difficult. The days when she sat at the head of a table and felt the weight of being the person everyone was looking at and had to choose consciously to let them look. To resist the old habit of deflection, of modesty, of making herself smaller than she was in order to fit into spaces that had been designed to hold someone else. She was learning to take up the right amount of room. She was learning that this was in fact the primary work. 6 months after the gala, on a cold evening in early winter, Meline stayed late in her office after everyone else had gone. The office was beautiful. She had designed it herself, or rather, she had specified what she wanted, and let the designer execute it. Clean lines, good, light, a desk that faced the window rather than the door. On the wall behind her desk, there was one framed object, a copy of her nameplate from the first day it had appeared on the building directory. Meline Carter, co-CEO, Carter Alvarez International. She sat at the desk and opened the file she had been building for the past 3 weeks. Not a strategy document or a client analysis, but something more personal. She had been thinking about the Carter Initiative's first full grant cycle, which was scheduled to launch in January. 12 women had already applied for litigation funding. 3 of them had cases that were in Margaret's assessment strong enough to pursue. The other 9 needed more documentation, more time, more support before they were ready to fight. Meline had read all 12 applications personally. She read them the way she had read the hashtag Hidden Architects testimonials, with the focused attention of someone for whom each story was not abstract, but immediate. Each one carried the specific weight of a life in which something valuable had been taken by someone who had trusted that the taking would not be named. She thought about the software engineer named Lisa Park, who had written in her application, "I developed the algorithm that made our product successful. My manager presented it as his breakthrough. Seeing what you did gives me the courage to believe that fighting back is actually possible." Meline had replied to that application personally. She had told Lisa to call Margaret's office and set up an intake meeting. She had told her that the Carter Initiative existed precisely for her. She looked at her phone now at the text from Margaret that had arrived that afternoon. Lisa Park's case is moving forward. Her company just agreed to settle. Full attribution-back compensation and a formal letter of acknowledgement for the official record. First Carter Initiative win. First. There would be others. Meline set her phone down and looked out the window at the city in its winter configuration, all bare branches and bright windows, the particular beauty of a place that has not stopped moving even in the cold. She was not done. She was, in fact, only beginning. But she had done something real. She had moved from invisible to visible, from erased to acknowledged, from someone else's hidden asset to the named architect of her own work, and the work of the women she was helping reclaim theirs. She had built a company that bore her name. She had built a foundation that bore her values. She had said the truest things she knew in the largest room she had ever stood in, and the world had heard her. That was not the end of the story, but it was the end of the part of it where she was afraid. Tomorrow there would be the Milan expansion to plan and the second round of initiative applications to review, and a board decision about the Warsaw Partnership that needed her strategic analysis before the week was out. Tonight she sat in her office with the city outside and the nameplate on the wall, and she was simply herself. Meline Carter, co-CEO, founder, architect, visible at last in all the ways she had always been. The second client that found her through the hashtag Hidden Architects conversation was a woman named Rachel Voss. Rachel was 41, a former brand strategist who had spent 11 years building a regional agency in collaboration with 2 male partners. Partners who had, over the course of a decade, systematically moved her into a secondary role while preserving the compensation structure that reflected her original equal ownership. She had not left. She had not sued. She had told herself for years that the arrangement was still better than starting over, and that the credit discrepancy was something she could manage internally, and that the situation would improve when things settled down, when the agency grew, when the right moment presented itself. She had found the right moment finally after watching Meline stand up in a ballroom on a live stream at 2 a.m. from a hotel room in Chicago, where she had been attending a conference for an industry that had stopped putting her name on anything 5 years earlier. She arrived at Meline's temporary office, still the apartment at this point, though the lease on the proper office space had been signed with a folder of documents and an expression of someone who has made a decision they are not entirely sure will hold under examination. "I've been building a case for 18 months, Rachel said, "before I even knew what to call it. I just started keeping things the way you apparently did." "The instinct doesn't lie," Meline said. "No," Rachel agreed. "It doesn't." They spent 2 hours going through Rachel's documentation. It was extensive and in several places better organized than she had. Credit for Rachel had been systematic in a way that suggested she had suspected for longer than she admitted that she would eventually need what she was compiling. "Your ownership claim is strong," Meline said when they finished. "Stronger than mine was actually because you maintained formal equity throughout." The misattribution of creative and strategic work is going to be the central argument, but the ownership structure gives you a foundation that I had to build from the IP side. You can make this directly about breach of fiduciary duty. Rachel absorbed this. I've been afraid to do anything for years, she said. I know it sounds exactly like what it is, Meline said. Fear. It's rational. The cost of acting when you're not sure you'll win is real. The cost of not acting when the situation is unsustainable is also real. There's no version of this that doesn't cost you something. Rachel was quiet for a moment. What made you finally do it? Meline thought about the November bedroom, the phone, the words on the screen, the shower running. I found out that not acting was also a choice, she said, that I was already losing things whether I fought or not. Once I understood that the math changed. Rachel nodded slowly. Then she straightened in her chair with the posture of someone who has made a decision and is committing to it. Okay, she said. What do I do first? First, Meline said, you call Margaret Chen. She gave Rachel the number. Rachel left with the folder and the number, and Meline thought something else, the particular quality of steadiness that comes from meeting someone who has already done the thing you're afraid of and survived it. That was she was coming to understand perhaps the most important thing she could offer. Not just the legal pathways or the professional network or the institutional resources of the Carter Initiative, but the evidence embodied that the other side of fear was habitable. The Carter Initiative's first formal grant cycle opened in January with 12 applications. By February, it had received 84. The deluge was both gratifying and sobering. Margaret expanded the legal review team to handle the volume. Meline hired a director to manage the operational side of the initiative, a former employment attorney named James Park, who had spent a decade representing workers in intellectual property disputes and had been waiting for someone to create this institution. You're going to need more infrastructure than you have, James told her frankly in his first week. I know, she said. Build it. He did. By March, the initiative had formal partnerships with legal clinics at 6 universities, a mentorship program, matching 40 women with professional advisors, and a grant portfolio of 7 active litigation cases, 4 of which had already reached settlement conversations. The settlements mattered not just for the individual women, but for the legal record they were beginning to create. Each successful attribution claim built precedent. Each public acknowledgement, whether from a company, a former partner, an institutional board, added another data point to the argument that this kind of invisible labor was real, had real value, and would be held to real legal account. Meline had not anticipated becoming a precedent setter. She had not set out to change the law. She had set out to reclaim her own work. But she was learning with increasing clarity that those 2 projects were not as separable as they appeared. You're making case law, Shub, Margaret told her one afternoon over coffee with the specific satisfaction of an attorney watching something important happen. Not just individually. The framework of how courts are beginning to understand collaborative attribution in non-traditional work contexts, your case, and the cases you're helping fund are building the intellectual architecture of that understanding. Appropriate, Meline said. Isn't it? Margaret agreed. Harrison Chen completed his European expansion in October. The German market entry framework executed exactly as Meline had designed it, the regulatory compliance structure performing as she had predicted, the first year of German operations coming in 18% above projection. He sent her a handwritten note, which she found more affecting than she expected. The German operations are exceeding every projection we had. More importantly, every person on our team knows exactly whose strategic work made it possible. Your name is in every document. I hope that's what it was always supposed to feel like. She read it twice. Then she put it in the file she was keeping of things that mattered, which had started as a professional archive and was becoming something else. She was building a record, not just of the work she had 5 years of that, but of what it felt like to have the work acknowledged, to have people name her as the architect, to walk into rooms where her reputation preceded her, where people had read her analyses and followed her frameworks and were interested in what she thought because they knew specifically that she was the one who thought it. It felt she was discovering entirely different from anything else she had experienced. It felt like something she had been capable of for a very long time, finally occupying its proper space. On a Thursday evening in late October, 11 months after the gala that had changed everything, Meline received a call she had not anticipated. The number was blocked. She answered anyway. Miss Carter, a woman's voice, professional, careful with the particular restraint of someone who has prepared for this call. My name is Jennifer Martinez. I'm a pharmaceutical researcher. I wrote you a message on social media several months ago about the drug framework. I don't know if you remember. I remember, Meline said. She remembered the post I developed, the preliminary framework for a drug that is now saving lives. My boss presented it as his breakthrough. A silence. Then, I filed a formal claim 3 months ago, against my employer and against my supervisor individually. I used a Carter Initiative grant to cover the legal costs. Another pause. I settled yesterday, full attribution of the framework in all official documentation, compensation for 5 years of intellectual property use, and a formal statement from the research director acknowledging my contribution to the drug's development. Meline sat down. She was not sure when she had stood up. Miss Carter, Jennifer Martinez said, they're going to put my name in the paper, in the actual scientific paper, where it should have been from the beginning. Meline said, I'm so glad. It was not enough. There were no words that were enough, but it was what she had. Thank you, Jennifer said. You gave me the proof that it was possible. After the call ended, Meline sat for a while in the quiet of her office, with the city outside and the nameplate on the wall. She thought about what it meant to give someone proof that something is possible, the specific weight of that, the specific responsibility. She had told her story because it was true and because she had run out of reasons to stay silent. She had not anticipated that the telling of it would become a kind of infrastructure, something others could build their own courage on. She was still learning what that meant, but she was learning it clearly with the same rigorous attention she had always brought to the things that mattered. She opened her laptop. She began to write not a strategy document, not a client analysis, but something personal. A letter to the women she would never meet, the ones who were still in their converted guest rooms at 3 in the morning, still compiling the folders they were not sure they would ever use. You are not alone in this room, she wrote. The work you are doing in silence is real. The instinct that tells you to keep the documentation, trust it. She wrote for an hour. When she stopped, the letter was long and specific and true, in the way that the truest things are not comfortable, not reassuring in the simple sense, but honest about what was hard and clear about what was possible. She posted it to the Carter Initiative's website. By morning, it had been shared 11,000 times. By the end of the week, 30 new applications had arrived for the initiative's grant program. By the end of the month, a law school in New York had reached out about creating the first dedicated legal clinic for collaborative work attribution modeled on Meline's case. She said yes to the law school. She said yes to the interview requests that would help her reach the women who needed to hear what she had learned. She said yes to the things that mattered, and she said no with increasing confidence to the things that did not. She was building the next phase of something that had already changed the shape of what she thought was possible, and she was doing it with her name on every piece of it. There was one more conversation she had been putting off. Not avoiding, she was past avoidance, as a strategy had left it behind somewhere in the months of legal combat and public exposure and the daily practice of being seen. But she had been waiting for the right moment, the moment when she could have it, without residue, without the interference of everything that was still actively unresolved. That moment arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late November, almost exactly a year after the night she had found the text message. She was reviewing the Warsaw Partnership analysis, the one that had replaced the Caldwell Global version she had written in the converted guest room 2 years earlier, this time under her own name for her own company, when her phone rang with a number she recognized. Ethan. She had unblocked it some weeks ago, not because she expected contact, but because the act of keeping it blocked had started to feel like a form of carrying him. She answered. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, he said. His voice was different than it had been in the months of legal combat, quieter, with none of the defensive energy she had grown accustomed to hearing in it. I just wanted to say one thing. She waited. I've been watching what you've built, he said. Carter Alvarez, the initiative. I've been reading about the cases you're funding and the women you're helping, and he stopped, started again. I spent a lot of time after everything telling myself that you were exaggerating, that what we had was genuinely collaborative, and that I had just failed to be clear about it publicly. I told myself that story for a long time. And now, Meline said, a long pause. Now I can see what you're building with full credit, he said, and I understand what I stole, not abstractly, concretely. I can see the size of it. She sat with that for a moment. Why are you telling me this? She asked, not hostilely, genuinely. Because I don't think you need it, he said. You don't need my acknowledgement. You've built something that doesn't require my acknowledgement. But I needed to say it anyway, for my own accounting. Meline looked out her office window at the November city. I appreciate that, she said. And then because it was true, I hope you build something honest with whatever comes next. She hung up. She sat for a moment with the window and the city and the year that had passed between the night in the dark bedroom and this afternoon in her own office with her own name on the door. Then she returned to the Warsaw analysis, and she worked until the evening, and the work was good, and it was hers, and the nameplate on the desk said so. 2 years after the Gala, Carter Alvarez International moved into its permanent headquarters. The building was in the financial district, 8 floors of glass and steel that had been empty for 2 years before Victor's acquisition team identified it as the right size and the right location, and perhaps most importantly, the right distance from the building where Caldwell Global had once operated. Not adjacent, not across the street, far enough that the view from Meline's office contained no reference points to the story she had left behind. The renovation had taken 4 months. Meline had been involved in every significant design decision, which she recognized was perhaps more time than a CEO should spend on interior architecture, but which she felt in this particular case was justified. The building was not just a workspace. It was a physical argument about how a company could be organized, about what it looked like when the principles it claimed to hold were built into its structure rather than written on a plaque in the lobby. The lobby itself contained one thing that most corporate headquarters did not: a timeline. Floor to ceiling, running the full length of the east wall, the timeline documented the complete history of Carter Alvarez International, including its complete and uncomfortable origins. The Caldwell Global years were there. The strategies were named and dated and attributed to their author. The Gala was there. The legal proceedings were there. The settlement was there. Most companies confronted with an origin story like this one would have buried it behind corporate artwork and carefully worded founding myths. Meline had insisted on the opposite. If we hide where we came from, she had told Victor when he raised the question, we can't demonstrate where we're going. Transformation is only meaningful if you're transparent about what was transformed. Victor had looked at the design mock-up for a long moment. Then he had said, put it on the wall, Bon. The grand opening was held on a Thursday in early spring, a late afternoon reception that filled the lobby and the conference rooms and spilled out onto the building's terrace, where the city spread in every direction in the particular clarity that arrives in spring after a long winter. Meline moved through the gathering with the ease of someone who had been practicing occupying her own space for 2 years and had gotten good at it. She greeted clients and partners and board members and journalists and the dozen women from the Carter Initiative who had been invited specifically because they were proof of something, proof that the principles the company was built on were not theoretical. Rachel Voss was there. Her settlement with her former partners had been finalized 6 months earlier. She had launched her own independent agency in the fall, and it was doing exactly as well as her documentation of her contributions had suggested it would, which was very well. She stood near the timeline wall looking at the section that documented the initiative's first year of operation with an expression that Meline recognized, the look of someone seeing their own experience reflected in a structure larger than themselves. This is extraordinary, Rachel said when Meline reached her. Not just what you've built, the fact that you built it in 2 years. We built it, Meline said. You're part of this. I'm one case, Rachel said. One case that became precedent, Meline replied. One case that 3 other women cited when they decided to file. One case whose settlement language we used as a template for 2 of the initiative's grant recipients. She looked at the timeline alongside Rachel. Nothing here is singular. That's the point. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to volunteer with the initiative. James mentioned there's a mentorship component, women who've been through the process supporting women who are just starting it. We'd want you, Meline said. Call James next week. Victor found her near the end of the evening when the crowd had thinned and the caterers were beginning the quiet work of clearing the tables. He appeared at her elbow the way he had at the first Gala, steady present, undemonstrative in the particular way of someone who does not need to announce his importance. Quite a night, he said. Quite a 2 years, she replied. They stood together looking out at the terrace, at the city that had been the backdrop of all of it the night she had stood in a ballroom and said her name, the months of legal combat, the gradual construction of something new out of the rubble of something stolen. I want to talk to you about Milan, Victor said. Meline smiled. You always want to talk about Milan. The expansion opportunity is genuinely time-sensitive, he said, but there was something lighter in his voice than pure business urgency. The Italian market is ready for the partnership framework you designed. The regulatory environment has shifted in the last 8 months in exactly the direction you predicted 18 months ago. I know, she said. I've been watching it. Of course you have. Victor turned to look at her. The initial analysis you prepared, the one you showed me at our first meeting under the Beaumont fiction. The analysis I prepared, she corrected mildly. The analysis you prepared, he agreed with the particular smile of a man who has learned the specific places where precision matters. It's more relevant now than when you wrote it. The market has moved toward your projections. He paused. It's good work, Meline. It was always good work. I know, she said, not with arrogance, with the plain certainty of someone who has been told for a long time that they don't know and has finally stopped accepting that instruction. Dinner next week to go through the framework, Tuesday, she said. Full attribution of the analysis and any documentation that comes out of it. Wouldn't have it any other way, Victor said. What? Later, after the guests had left and the building had settled into the particular quiet of a new space at the end of its first significant evening, Meline rode the elevator to the top floor and walked to her office. She had been in this office for 4 months now, in the temporary version that had preceded the move to the permanent headquarters. She had grown accustomed to it, the specific quality of its light at different times of day, the way the city looked from its windows in rain versus clarity, the sound the building made at night when its population had gone home, and it was simply itself. She sat at her desk and did not turn on her laptop. She sat in the dark with the city outside and let herself be still for a few minutes, which was something she was learning to do to allow the stillness to not immediately fill it with the next analysis or the next decision or the next thing that needed her attention. The work would be there in the morning. The Milan expansion would be there. The third grant cycle applications, which had come in at 140 this time, would be there. Tonight, she let herself simply exist in what she had built. She thought about the night 2 years ago when she had sat in the dark in a hotel room and looked in a mirror and recognized the woman she was becoming. She had not known then exactly what that woman would build. She had known only that she intended to build something and that it would be hers, and that it would be honest, and that it would matter beyond her own individual reclamation. She had been right about all of it. She opened her laptop, not for work, for something she had been thinking about for several weeks, something that had clarified in the past few hours of the opening reception, watching the initiative women talking to the Carter Alvarez clients, watching Rachel stand at the timeline wall, watching the particular quality of attention that moved through the room when people understood what they were looking at. She opened a new document. The Carter Initiative Annual Report she typed at the top, Year 2. Then below it the numbers that told the story in the plainest possible terms. 214 applications received, 31 cases funded, 19 settlements reached, 19 formal attributions secured, 19 women who now have the official legal documented record of what they built. She paused over that last number. 19 was not a large number in any absolute sense. Against the scale of the problem, the pervasive, structural, deeply embedded phenomenon of invisible labor and stolen intellectual credit, 19 was a beginning, nothing more. But beginnings were what you built from. She kept writing. In our second year of operation, the Carter Initiative expanded to 12 university partner clinics serving women in 16 states. Our mentorship program has connected 220 women with professional advisors and career counselors. Our grant program has funded legal representation for 31 cases with a settlement rate of 61%, significantly above the industry average for similar intellectual property claims. She paused again. Below the statistics, she wanted to say something that the statistics could not contain. She thought about Jennifer Martinez and her name in the scientific paper. She thought about Rachel at the timeline wall. She thought about the 12 women at the reception who had each arrived carrying a version of the same story and had each, through different paths, found their way to the other side of it. Numbers tell some of the story, she wrote, but the part that matters most is not countable. It is the moment when a woman who has been told directly and indirectly that her contributions don't count, that she is support staff rather than architect collaborator, rather than creator, grateful dependent rather than equal partner, discovers that she is wrong. That she has always been wrong to accept that assessment, that the work she did in the dark was real and has always been real, and that there are pathways to having that reality acknowledged. That moment is what the Carter Initiative exists to create. She read it back. She made 3 small adjustments. Then she kept writing. The report took 2 hours. When it was done, she sent it to James for review and closed her laptop and sat for a while longer in the quiet of the office. She thought about the letter she had written on the night of the settlement, the one addressed to herself, to the woman she had been in the bedroom 2 years ago with the phone in her hand. She had not sent it anywhere. It was still on her laptop in a folder she hadn't opened in months. She opened it now. She read it slowly, the way you read something that was written by a version of yourself you can now only access in memory. Right now you are terrified, she had written. You've just discovered that the man you love has been systematically erasing you while planning to discard you. You feel small and powerless and utterly invisible. But I need you to know something. You are none of those things. She read to the end. The words still held. Still had the quality of things written from inside genuine darkness by someone who had not yet arrived on the other side of it. She was grateful to that version of herself for writing them. She was grateful in the particular way you can only be grateful in retrospect for every decision that version had made. She closed the document. She opened a new one. Dear Meline, she wrote. Not the woman she had been, the woman she was. 2 years ago, you stood in a ballroom and said your name. You have spent the 2 years since building everything that name implies. You have built a company that bears it. You have built a foundation that enacts its values. You have built a record legal public institutional of what you contributed and what it was worth and what it cost to make that contribution visible. You have also built something harder to measure. She paused, looked at the city, looked at the nameplate on the desk. You have built the habit of presence, the practice of being seen, the specific daily courage of existing in your own name rather than behind someone else's. That is not a small thing. It is perhaps the hardest thing, and you have done it, and you are doing it, and you will keep doing it. The work is not finished. It will not be finished in your lifetime, probably. The problem you have spent 2 years fighting is older than you and larger than you, and will require generations of women doing what you have done before it is genuinely resolved. But you have made a contribution to that resolution that is real, that is documented, that is for the first time in your professional life completely and irrevocably yours. You are Meline Carter. The world knows your name, and you have used it for something worth the knowing. She saved the document. She put it in the same folder as the first letter. Then she turned off the lamp on her desk and sat for a moment in the dark, the good dark, the voluntary dark, the dark of someone who has the lamp and knows where it is, and has simply chosen to sit without it for a while. Through the window, the city was everything it always was, relentless and indifferent, and full of people building and dismantling and beginning. She was one of them. She had always been one of them. She had simply for too long been building under someone else's name. Not anymore. She stood. She gathered her bag and her coat. She took one last look at the office, her office in her building named for her company, carrying her intellectual history on its lobby wall for anyone who walked in to read and understand. She turned off the lights. She walked to the elevator. She wrote it down through the floors of the building she had built past the lobby and the timeline and the proof written in glass and steel and the documented history of her own mind that she had been here. The lobby was empty except for the overnight security guard who nodded as she passed. "Good night, Ms. Carter," he said. "Good night," she said. She walked out into the spring evening, the city alive around her with its million parallel stories, its constant churn of ambition and loss and beginning. And she walked toward home. Her heels on the pavement, her name in the air, her work finally entirely hers. 6 months later, the Carter Initiative received a grant from a national foundation supporting workplace equity, its largest single gift to date. With the funding, it expanded its university clinic network to 22 institutions and launched its first cohort of legal fellows, 6 attorneys, dedicated full-time to intellectual property reclamation cases, funded entirely by the initiative. Carter Alvarez International's Milan expansion launched in autumn, generating first-year revenues that exceeded projections by 22%. The strategic framework was publicly credited to Meline Carter in all client-facing documentation and press materials. The hashtag Hidden Architects conversation continued. In its third year, it had become less a trending moment and more a permanent feature of the professional landscape, a gathering place for the ongoing work of naming invisible labor and demanding its recognition. Ethan Caldwell launched a small consulting practice that operated modestly and without significant industry attention. He gave one interview in which he acknowledged in careful language that he had not properly credited his former wife's contributions to Caldwell Global. The interview was not widely covered. Rachel Voss's independent agency won its first industry award in the spring. In her acceptance speech, she thanked the Carter Initiative. She also thanked by name the woman who had read her documentation at a kitchen table and told her that the instinct to keep the evidence was one worth trusting. Chloe Bennett joined the Carter Initiative as a volunteer coordinator in the mentorship program. She was James Park reported exceptionally good at it. Meline Carter continued to work. She continued to name herself. She continued to build things that were hers. That is the whole of it. That is enough. Bomb. The first time someone cited Meline Carter's case in a formal legal brief that had nothing to do with her, she did not hear about it for 3 weeks. Margaret called her on a Tuesday morning with the kind of energy she reserved for developments that genuinely surprised her, which after 30 years of litigation was a short list. A case out of Seattle, she said without preamble. Employment attorney representing a software architect against a Series B startup. The brief cites Carter versus Caldwell Global as a precedent for intellectual property attribution in non-traditional collaborative work structures. Meline set her coffee down slowly. They cited it formally. In the preliminary filing, the judge accepted the precedent argument. A pause. Your case law, Meline. She sat with that for a long moment. Case law. The careful accumulated grammar of what the legal system had decided to understand, built citation by citation, case by case, over generations of people refusing to accept that injustice was simply the way of things. She had not set out to make case law. She had set out to reclaim her work. But she was beginning to understand not intellectually, which she had understood for a while, but in the cellular way that understanding finally arrives when it has fully traveled from the mind to the body, that reclamation and systemic change were not separate projects. That the most personal act of resistance done with sufficient precision and courage could become a structural contribution to something much larger than the individual who performed it. She thought about the women who had shaped the legal understanding of the categories she was now operating within. Women who had stood in rooms and said the truest things they knew in front of audiences who did not want to hear them and had been believed eventually, and whose names appeared now in legal briefs and classroom discussions and the quiet architecture of the law. She wanted her name in that company. Not for vanity, she had burned through enough vanity in the fires of the past 2 years to arrive at something cleaner, but because being in that company meant the work she had done mattered beyond its immediate occasion, meant it would continue after her, meant the women who came after her would have something to stand on that she had helped build. "Tell me about the Seattle case," she said. Margaret told her. The law school clinic launched in the fall, the first dedicated legal clinic for collaborative work attribution in the country. Meline attended the opening with James Park, and Margaret and 3 of the initiative's earliest grant recipients who had been invited to speak about their experiences. The clinic was named with the directness that characterized everything Meline had built in the past 2 years, the Carter Attribution Clinic. Its mandate was narrow and specific to represent individuals whose intellectual property had been misattributed in collaborative professional contexts, with particular focus on cases involving power imbalances, employer/employee, partner/partner spouse/spouse. The dean of the law school introduced her before her remarks with the biographical sketch that had become over the past 2 years the official version of who she was in the public record. Columbia-trained attorney, former corporate litigator, co-CEO of Carter Alvarez International, founder of the Carter Initiative, author of strategic frameworks that had become industry benchmarks for European market expansion. She had not authored that biography. It had been assembled from facts, from the documented record of her own life. She stepped to the podium and looked out at the assembled faculty and students' faces that were young and attentive and in possession of something she had not fully possessed at their age, the knowledge that the fight she was describing was a real one, that it had a shape and a legal framework and a growing body of precedent, that it was winnable. "I want to start by telling you about a filing cabinet," she said. The room was quiet and attentive. "For approximately 1 year before I took any formal action, I kept a filing cabinet in my home office where I made copies of every major strategic document I had authored for my husband's company. I did it almost unconsciously at first. Instinct. The trained habit of the litigator who had spent years understanding that what you can prove matters more than what you know." She paused. "I kept those documents before I had a name for what I was doing, before I had fully articulated even to myself the nature of the injustice I was experiencing. I kept them because something in me understood that the work was real, and that the official record was wrong, and that someday, somehow, those two facts would need to be reconciled." She looked at the faces in the front row first-year students. Some of them who had chosen law for the reasons people choose law, because they believe in the possibility of documented truth, of evidence of the careful architecture of a provable case standing in opposition to comfortable fiction. "What I want you to take from this clinic," she said, "is not just the legal framework. The doctrine and the precedent and the procedural tools, those matter enormously, and you will learn them here, and they will be genuinely useful. But underneath all of that, what I want you to carry with you is this: the women who come to you will already know the truth. They will have been living inside it for years. What they need from you is not the truth, they have that. What they need is the architecture, the legal structure that can take what they know to be true and make it provable. Make it official. Make it part of the record that outlasts the people who tried to erase it." She paused. Let the room hold the silence for a moment. "The filing cabinet mattered," she said. "What you build here will matter more, because this clinic means that the next woman who opens that filing cabinet won't have to figure out alone what to do with what she finds in it. She'll have someone to call." The applause was warm and sustained. She stepped back from the podium and stood in it, absorbing it. Not performing gratitude, not deflecting, simply receiving it as something that had been earned by work done in good faith over time. She was learning to do that. It was taking practice. The year turned. Carter Alvarez International closed its second full year of operation with revenues 40% above projection and a client roster that had grown to 22 companies across 6 countries. The European expansion work, the work that had begun in a converted guest room and been attributed to someone else, and then reclaimed through 2 years of legal and professional combat, was now the foundation of something legitimate and growing and publicly credited. The Carter Initiative funded 42 cases in its third grant cycle. 29 reached settlement. 3 went to trial. All 3 won. Meline hired her 5th analyst in the spring, a young woman named Sophia, who had left a strategy consulting firm after a senior partner had presented her market segmentation methodology as his own in a client pitch. Sophia had the documentation. She had not known what to do with it until she found the initiative's website. She was, Meline thought, watching her work through the orientation materials in the conference room on her first day, exactly the person she had been trying to build the infrastructure for. Someone brilliant. Someone who had been made invisible by a system that found it convenient. Someone who, with the right support and the right legal framework and the right employer, would do extraordinary work that would bear her name. "Welcome," Meline told her. "Thank you," Sophia said. Then, with the directness of someone who had decided life was too short for the long way around, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." The story, the gala, the legal case, all of it, was it worth it, all the things it cost you? Meline considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "What it cost me," she said, was a marriage that had already cost me my career and my professional identity, and 5 years of work I was never going to get official credit for in that context. She paused. What I got back was myself, my name, my work. The ability to sit in this office as the person who built what's being built here. She looked at the nameplate on the desk. And the Carter Initiative, which is going to outlast me and help people I'll never meet and create legal frameworks that will make the fight easier for the next generation. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then, so yes, Meline said. On a Friday afternoon in late spring, 2 years and 5 months after the night, she had found a text message glowing in the dark. Meline sat in her office after the last meeting of the day and did something she had been putting off for no particular reason. She opened the folder on her laptop that contained the two letters, the one written the night of the settlement addressed to her past self, and the one written on the night of the grand opening addressed to the woman she had become. She read them both. Then she opened a new document and wrote a third. Dear Meline, you are no longer in the process of becoming. You have arrived somewhere, though the territory continues to expand around you, and the edges of it remain uncertain in the way that all living territory is uncertain. What you have built is real. What you have proven is real. What you have changed in the legal record, in the institutional landscape, in the specific lives of specific women who found their way to the Carter Initiative and used what they found there as real. You spent 5 years invisible. You have spent 2 years learning to be seen. You are still learning. You will always be learning. That is not a failure of completion. It is the structure of a life that is still actually being lived. There are things you do not yet know about what comes next. You do not know what the initiative will become, or what Carter Alvarez will build in its next decade, or what the legal framework you have helped create will look like when it has had another generation to accumulate. You will learn those things by living toward them. What you do know is this: you are Meline Carter. You have a law degree from Columbia University and 6 years of experience in corporate litigation and 5 years of strategic work that turned a regional import company into an international presence and 2 years of building something entirely your own. You walked into a ballroom and said your name. The world heard you. Everything that has happened since has been the world answering. She saved the document. She put it in the folder with the others. She closed her laptop. She stood. She looked out the window at the city in late spring, all that green arriving at the edges of things, all that insistent, recurring, unstoppable life pushing back against the concrete and steel that had tried to contain it. She picked up her bag. She turned off the light. She walked out of her office past the nameplate that said Meline Carter, co-CEO, past the conference rooms where her analysts were finishing their own work for the week, into the elevator and down through the floors and out through the lobby where the timeline ran the full length of the east wall. The whole story, every uncomfortable piece of it displayed with the calm certainty of something that does not require anyone's permission to be true. She nodded to the security guard. She walked out into the spring evening. The city moved around her, all those lives, all that motion, all that brilliant and ordinary and unceasing human effort to build something that lasts. She was part of it. She had always been part of it, even in the years when she had not been allowed to put her name on what she built. Those years were part of her story. These years were part of her story. All of it, the hidden part and the visible part, the years of silence and the years of speaking, all of it was hers. All of it had made her what she was. Meline Carter walked home through the spring evening with the knowledge of everything she had built moving quietly alongside her, and the knowledge of everything she would still build moving ahead of her, and between those two certainties, the completed and the coming, she was exactly herself. Finally, completely, hers. But she did not think about Ethan Caldwell often anymore. When she did, which was less frequent with each passing month as the accumulated weight of new work displaced the old grief, she thought about him without particular feeling. Not anger, not residue of love, not the cold satisfaction she had expected reclamation to leave behind. Just a kind of clear-eyed observation, the way you might observe weather that is past. He had been a man who had believed that taking credit for someone else's work was a manageable form of ambition. He had been wrong about the manageability. He had been wrong about a great many things. He had to his credit acknowledged some of them in the end, not publicly, not loudly, but in the private accounting that he had called her to share on the November night a year after the settlement. She had to her own credit heard it, had accepted it at its real value, which was modest, and had wished him well in the plain and genuine way of someone who no longer required anything from the person they are wishing well, that she thought was what full reclamation looked like. Not just the legal ownership, not just the professional reputation, not just the documented record. The interior freedom of no longer being defined even in opposition by the person who had tried to define you. She was defined by her own work, by the company with her name on it, by the initiative that carried her values, by the cases she had funded and the women she had helped and the law she had helped make. She was defined by herself. That had taken 2 years. She thought it had been exactly worth it. On the last day of spring, which happened to be a Friday, Meline left the office at 6 and walked the long way home down through the financial district, past the old Caldwell Global building, blank and unremarkable. Now occupied by a different company, its history compressed into an institutional footnote across the park, where the trees were fully leafed and the evening light fell through them in the particular golden way of late May, and then up through her neighborhood to the building where she lived. She had bought the apartment outright in the fall, with her own money from her own settlement under her own name. 3 bedrooms, 1 for sleeping, 1 for working one, she had turned into the kind of office she had always wanted: large windows. Good light bookshelves that held the books she had actually read rather than the books that looked impressive on shelves. She had furnished it slowly and deliberately, choosing each piece for function and preference rather than performance. There was nothing in it that was someone else's taste. Every object in every room was there because she had decided it should be. She let herself in. She made tea. She stood at her kitchen window looking out at the evening and thought about nothing in particular for a few minutes. Just the evening. Just the tea. Just the specific and unremarkable texture of a Friday at the end of a good week. Then she went to her office and sat at her desk and opened her laptop. Not to work, to write. She had started in the past few months to keep something that was not quite a journal and not quite a professional log, but something in between a running account of what she was building and why addressed to no particular reader but written as though it mattered, which was the only way she had ever known how to write. She wrote for half an hour. About the clinic, about Sophia, about the Seattle case and what it meant for the development of attribution law, about the Milan expansion and the particular elegance of watching a framework she had designed perform exactly as she had predicted it would perform. About the work, about what it felt like to do the work with your name on it, about how that feeling had not faded in 2 years, had not become ordinary or expected, but had remained present as a kind of daily gift, the specific renewable pleasure of existing in your own professional life as the person you actually are. She saved the document and closed the laptop. She picked up her tea and carried it to the window and stood looking out at the city settling into evening. All those lights coming on one by one, floor by floor, building by building, each one a person at the end of their own day in the middle of their own story. She was one of them. She had always been one of them. She had been the hidden architect, once brilliant and invisible, building empires that bore other names laboring in the dark because the dark had been the only space made available to her. She was not that anymore. She was the name on the door. She was the record in the legal brief. She was the voice that had stood in a ballroom and split the silence open. She was the foundation that turned that voice into infrastructure. She was all of it, the story and the aftermath, the theft and the reclamation, the invisibility and the full irrevocable publicly documented fact of being seen. She was Meline Carter. And the world finally and completely knew her name.